All right, what's happening, squad? Stoked to have everybody back on the channel today. So I must say, I have a really special guest joining me for this live stream, which I'm super excited about. This is my friend Alex from Saints and Saguaros YouTube channel. And so, anyways, but today, and I'll get in a little bit more into Alex's channel and then let him explain from there. But today, basically, what we're going to be going over is these discussions surrounding God's omniscience. And then from there, we'll dovetail into both questions from the live chat and then also talk about how these questions are in some ways a linchpin for other theological discussions that will arise based off of how we answer this question surrounding God's omniscience. So anyways, I'm stoked again to have my friend Alex on the channel. Alex, how you doing tonight, brother? I know we were just chatting about it, but...
Yeah, doing great. It's surreal to be on with you because I spent years watching YouTube theology channels, and it's surreal to actually talk to one of the channels I watched for a while. So
yeah, it's cool, man. I feel the same way, bro. The first time I talked to some of the people I'd been watching, I was like, wow, they talk back. It's like that. Have you seen that great commercial on TV where like the football player will like look at the people watching and like ask them like what they should do? That's how I kind of felt.
Yeah.
But anyways, cool, Alex. Well, again, I'm super stoked to have you on. So I will say for those watching live, and I'll plug this in the middle as well, like when, usually more people show up in the middle, but I also want to plug it now for those watching after as well. If you have not checked out Alex's channel, Saints and Saguaros, he's got some fascinating stuff on there. And he's done some recent videos that I can definitely like plug on God's omniscience, which are really, really fascinating. And so that's kind of what we're going to be hopping into today. But with that said, Alex, do you want to just begin by telling our audience, and again, I'm excited to hear as well, because I don't know the answer to all these questions, just a little bit about your story, your churchmanship, your background, how you've kind of found yourself moving into this ministry. Where did this, obviously the prompting comes from the Holy Spirit. What is it that the Spirit has put on your heart to try and accomplish with your channel as a ministry? But I'll kind of let you take off from here, and then we'll get into the specific questions here in a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, my name's Alex again. Thanks for having me on. I grew up sort of typical non-denominational Bible church, small non-denominational Bible church for many years. Basically since I was born until a few years ago. And a few years ago, I transitioned into an ACNA church locally here in Arizona. So yeah, I'm super new to Anglicanism as well. That's why I feel like I have questions for you, because I'm trying to navigate this all as I'm joining the Anglican Church. But just kind of became convinced of a more sacramental understanding of Christianity, of infant baptism, things like that. I became convicted that I needed to baptize my own children, so I baptized my own children recently.
Amen.
Yeah, and that's what's sort of been my journey. So as for the YouTube channel, I'm kind of just figuring this out as I go. I spent years watching, I feel like all you guys, these amazing theology channels online. And I've always dreamed of like, man, I would love to like just talk to these people and get to know more. I feel like in order to do that, I sort of have to put out some of my own thoughts so that people sort of know who I am and where I'm coming from. But really, I'm just mostly in this to learn. Like I have my own thoughts, but I didn't go to school for this. I'm very new. I feel very like I'm swimming in deep waters here, and I want to learn from all you guys that have studied this more than I have.
Well, can I just say, for those watching who don't know Alex, so if you watch Alex's last two videos on God's omniscience, don't sell yourself short, bro. I'm watching these and I'm like, this is the guy I need to talk to about this question, because actually your knowledge and your experience is incredibly rich when it comes to these questions. And I found it like very, very helpful to kind of go through your intellectual journey. And again, in a sense, I'm really intrigued to hear you kind of explicate a little bit how you've worked through the questions surrounding God's omniscience in Calvinism, Arminianism, and then kind of where you've landed, why you find it challenges in various ways. And your journey, I so resonated with, because I totally get that journey, even though I have a different churchmanship that I grew up with. And then from there, where has that led you to the convictions that you hold now? I actually think that's fascinating. So I just want to say for those watching, I wouldn't sell yourself short here, bro. I want to also say that some of the best theology channels that I find are actually people who basically have started it in a sense while they're on their own journey. So, for example, like, Austin Suggs would probably have said something similar, and his is one of the best theology channels, I think, out there. So I actually think that's a great way to go about it. I do have to ask a personal question. What church are you at in Arizona? If
Living
you don't mind
Faith.
me
Are you
asking.
familiar with Living Faith?
Okay. I don't
It's
know.
in
So
Tempe.
when I moved into the ACNA, one of my priests was in, it was a diocese of the West ACNA parish there. But anyways, he was one of the I think he was a curate there. So I actually have a little bit of, not personal ties there necessarily, but I was wondering if it's the same church. It may be.
Okay.
But anyways, cool, man. Well, real quick, before we get into anything, I just want to give a shout out to my boy. Thank you so much for this, man. This is really, really kind. So I wanted to just go through these 2 comments he dropped. And then Alex, if from there, if this is cool, then I'm just going to give you the reins to start maybe explaining a little bit of your journey and your wrestlings back and forth with Calvinism, Arminianism, and then kind of where you've landed where you are. But so my friend, Prodigal Purple Prophet, thank you again. This is so kind, and I really appreciate it. Really want to talk about being convinced that those in covenantal relationships which prescribe sin as an essential feature shouldn't be able to facilitate that mass. Interesting. Let me think about this question a little bit more. Sorry, I want to think about this, my friend. So really want to talk about being convinced that those in covenantal relationships which prescribe sin as an essential feature shouldn't be able to facilitate at mass. Interesting. To be clear, I pray for the salvation of all, but how the mass is conducted and who's allowed to lead the people is of grave importance. I do think that I would say it's very important that anybody engaging in any of these liturgical ministries, I think the priest who's presiding at any particular mass is basically in control of a lot of things. But I do think, I would struggle to say, like, I don't know exactly what you're saying, but if somebody's living in like a morally corrupt situation and then also as a chalice bearer, I would see that as a problem as well. But I think in some ways it starts with the priest being able to, say, hey, there are standards by which we receive. And so I would give that reflection. But feel free to drop more in the comments, bro, if there's something more specific you're kind of wrestling back and forth here with. But I would say I do think it's important that we even give the images the church that there is a standard to receiving, right? And that you're living a life that's faithful to the Lord. And yeah, I think that's important. So cool. All right. Well, I appreciate you, brother, very much so. All right, Alex, cool. Well, do you want to go ahead and just start by sharing a little bit of your journey? Feel free to go as in depth as you want, but do you want to start by basically sharing your wrestlings back and forth between Calvinism, Arminianism, and then kind of why you've landed where you are? And then I think that'll get the conversation going from here.
Yeah, sure. I think growing up, in the context I was in, there were some people that were more like Calvinistic Reformed leaning. They would have held to like the 5 points of Calvinism, but they would have been obviously in a Baptist sort of evangelical context. And then another group was sort of Arminian leaning, but they still probably would have held to eternal security. So like once saved, always saved. And those are kind of the 2 sides that I was familiar with. And I think I struggled with both of those because if you go the sort of more sovereignty, predestination, Calvinist side, I just really struggled to understand how you can meaningfully hold people to be responsible for sin, for whether they end up in hell, things like that. Questions like, well, who caused Satan to sin? Those kinds of things. Seems like you end up with a God who's sort of responsible for evil in a very direct way, and that just made me very uncomfortable. And then on the other side, on the Arminian side, I didn't see good answers either, because you run into this problem of God's foreknowledge. So, okay, well, maybe people freely choose to sin, so that explains why they are responsible, and it explains why there's evil and hell and so on. But did God know that they were going to sin ahead of time? Did he know that certain people were going to end up in hell ahead of time? And if so, why did he create them? It seems pretty cruel to create someone that is going to go to hell. Why did God create Satan if he knew that Satan was going to sin and cause all this havoc? And so I think you just end up with that sort of problem of either God seems responsible for evil, or you end up with a God who creates people that you end up with problems with God's foreknowledge, And I kind of, in reading C.S. Lewis, I sort of got tipped off to the idea that there's maybe other options. There's an escape route. So Great Divorce has like a section at the end where the main character is talking to MacDonald, and there's this dialogue about free will and about predestination, these kinds of things. And the basic point is, if you can sort of try and step back and look outside of time and look at God's entire sovereign plan and that he predestined it all. And maybe that's true in some sense, but when you do that, you lose this sense of freedom. And that's what C.S. Lewis is saying there. And freedom is essential because that's the way in which we most reflect our creator, is what he says, which I always thought was interesting. So I was like, okay, he has some kind of robust understanding of free will. And I started reading more, and you get to it in some of his other books. Paralandra, there's a little passage on free will, right as the main character is about to go fight the bad guy. There's this, section on, do my choices even matter? Does it matter whether I choose to do this or not? And yeah, there's other really interesting things. And then finally, I read Saint Boethius. He has this book called Consolation of Philosophy, and he sort of lays out his idea there of divine timelessness. And to me, this just sort of solved that problem of like, do we have a God that's responsible for evil, or a God that we have problems with foreknowledge? And I guess I can get into that. Do you have? I'll pause for a second.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, man. Can I just throw out maybe like a concept? I've said this before on the channel in the past, but I think this question gets at the heart, and so I'll just lay this out, and I'll let you get right back to it. So, I heard one time Frank Turek was on. Anyways, he was on like a panel of some sort, dialoguing with an atheist thinker. And basically, what the video I was watching was actually James White giving a reflection of this video. And basically what he said is, so he's listening to it. And what the atheist was asking Frank Turek is, if God knew with 100% certainty that Adam and Eve would eat from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, if God knew that with 100% certainty before creating them, then who really made that choice? And then the way Frank Turek responds, he goes, see, that's Molinism, right? Because he speaks of, basically that there are different paths to some degree, or at least that's James White's take on it. And then James White is, no, God did decree that, but ultimately for his glory. And I know watching that, I go, certainly I can't, like, I don't find the question of, I don't think it's possible for God to ordain things ahead of time that he knows would be evil. Like, I think that's outside of the nature of God. However, I also get what you're saying, that the Arminian or Molinist side can have challenges as well, unless we think of it anachronistically. And then I think that gets to Boethius' thing. That's been my thought process through it. So anyways, I just wanted to say, I think it's a similar type of question, but I'll let you go from here, bro, and kind of explain then how you've come to Boethius's, or how that affected you, basically the way you viewed it.
Yeah, totally. It's helpful, I think, to just sort of eliminate I sort of go in my video and eliminate the options one by one. So there are various ways to sort of solve this. I think that gives us clarity. So determinism would be the very straightforward, like God decrees all things. And that, both you and I are going to reject, because it just really seems like God is then responsible for evil in the most direct sense.
Yeah.
And, we have verses like, God does not tempt anyone. It just seems like there's this sense in scripture that God is not directly responsible for evil in this very direct causative kind of way. I understand that Calvinists have responses to that, but I just don't find them satisfying. The libertarian option, so this is just libertarian free will. And a lot of people struggle with the concept of libertarian free will. I addressed some of those objections in my video, but I would just understand it as like, we have free will in a limited way, in the way that God has free will. Like, God is the first cause of his own. I call it being a first cause. Like, he's the first cause of his own choices. Yeah. He's the first cause of the question to why creation is this way rather than that way. There's nothing outside of God that determines that. He is in himself a first cause of that choice. Yeah. And so we, in a limited way, are like God in that way. We have libertarian free will like he has it. And so that's how I describe libertarian free will. But if you just have libertarian free will by itself without a coherent view of God's foreknowledge, you end up with this problem of like, did God know ahead of time, that certain people would do evil, that Satan would do evil, and did he create them anyway? You end up with the same kind of question. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we get into Molinism. So Molinism is this view, and the way I like to describe it is, if people have seen Marvel's Endgame.
Yeah.
So, spoilers here.
Yeah.
So in it, the character Doctor Strange, he looks into the future and looks at millions of possible futures and finds the one where the heroes win. And then he arranges circumstances so that timeline actually occurs. So that's sort of the idea of Molinism. So there's many possible timelines. God doesn't decide what those are going to be, but he just chooses the one that's going to happen. He arranges circumstances so that that one's going to obtain. And that sounds attractive at first, because it sounds like you're balancing free will and God's sovereignty. But I think it just runs into all kinds of problems. Like that atheist in your conversation was pointing out, it still seems like God is responsible for evil, because, I use the analogy of, like, if I have a dog on a leash and I know for certain that if I let go of that dog, it's going to go maul somebody, and then I still let go of the leash and it goes and mauls somebody, who's responsible? Well, maybe the dog is responsible, but also I'm responsible because I chose to do it knowing it would happen. And so you still get a God that's responsible for evil in this very kind of direct way. And then you also have what's called the grounding problem. So this gets a little bit technical, but the way I like to describe it is, imagine, all these possible timelines, like there's millions of possible timelines. Imagine writing them all out on a menu. In Molinism, God doesn't create the menu. He just chooses from the menu. So the question is, well, who makes the menu? And in Molinism, the answer, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, creatures in their free will make the menu. But that can't be, because God is choosing the timeline before any of these creatures are created. So first of all, none of them exist. Some of them are never going to exist because they exist only in hypothetical timelines. So can creatures that are hypothetical, that never ever come to exist, can they be responsible for this menu of options? I don't think they can be. So you end up with this, this answer of, like, well, the menu is just sort of a brute fact that God doesn't control. It's just there. He's bound to picking from this menu of options. And I just don't find that satisfying. I mean, that just seems like a huge problem. Like, who is greater, the person choosing from the menu or the person making the menu? And so because of all these problems with Molinism, some people land at open theism. So this is the idea that libertarian free will does exist, and God doesn't know the future. He doesn't actually exhaustively know the future. And people land at this because there are just these problems with Molinism. They just sort of take the nuclear option and reject divine foreknowledge. And I mean, I understand how they get there, but I just find that view, like, I don't think it's acceptable for Christians. I think we should hold that God is sort of the greatest conceivable being, that he needs to have exhaustive knowledge of the future in order for things like prophecy to make sense, and so on.
Yeah. Alex, can I ask you a question before we go further, bro?
Yeah.
So I think your thought process here is so fascinating. I will say, as one, I am definitely not an open theist. What's interesting is my philosophy professor from seminary drilled in that he thought open theism could still potentially be orthodox, but I agree with you that I struggle with open theism. So I definitely, to me, that's not really an option on the table. But I will just give that plug from my philosophy professor. So, I want to be careful to speak on that, which I know not. But what I will say, I want to ask you this question just real quick. So I have no idea what your views on science are. But I will say that in my mind, almost every single one of these options that you just laid out, when I'm doing my thought process, are inherently and feel free to disagree with me. That's why I really want to know your reflection on this. In my mind, they're all inherently based on Newtonian physics. So, like, that time was, time is, and time will be. And so they're based off of our experience of time as beings created inside of time. But what I think is Boethius's vision opens us up to a different way of thinking that I actually contend is almost completely in line with Einsteinian physics, which is fascinating. But anyways, I won't ask too much there. I guess my question for you was, do you think that that's true, that in some ways the base assumption of all of the views that you just laid out, whether it's Calvinism, open theism, Arminianism, all these types of ways of Molinism, they all to some degree are based in time was, time is, time will be. And they're kind of thinking through time that way. Do you think that's a fair reflection? Or please feel free to disagree. I'm really curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like, this idea, we're going to get to this, right, that God is outside of time. I think that's really, really key and important. What's odd to me is that a lot of people, like say Aquinas, did believe that God was outside of time, but still held to something like compatibilism or determinism.
So, you know what? And I would say, and I'll give it back to you then, because I want you to go into Boethius. I actually have become convinced that Aquinas is actually very similar to Boethius. But if you've done like extensive research on Aquinas, I'd be fascinated to hear but to my, at least my understanding of Aquinas, I think it's somewhat complicated, his view, but I actually usually will contend that that Aquinas is indebted to Boethius, and then later on somebody like Wesley, who's indebted to Boethius. I know there's like a long book out there if people are interested, tying Wesley's theology with Aquinas directly here, which is really interesting. But anyways, I'll let you go from here. But I actually kind of see this strain of like, I think Boethius dominates the patristic age ultimately. And then I think that Aquinas obviously dominates the scholastic age, but he's drawing from Boethius. And then I actually think that leads to, I actually think Wesley's view, when it's really understood, is he's basically a Carolingian, if you know that term, Alex, but he's basically a 17th century divine. But the 17th century divines were all about the Ad Fontes movement, which is returning to the fathers. And so I think Wesley's basically just trying to live out Boethius's view in his way he's parsing this. But anyways, I'll give it back to you, bro. I'm interested to hear you move into Boethius. And feel free to talk on Aquinas if you see Aquinas very differently than that. It's actually really interesting to me, that subject.
No, yeah, I defer to you on Aquinas. That's interesting. I need to look into that more. When I've heard the view expressed by Thomists, it sounds like a kind of compatibilism. So they think that determinism at the base level is true. God determines everything, and that's compatible with some concept of free will. And I guess I find that view problematic. I've heard so I guess I'll talk about compatibilism for a second, because that's what I've always understood Aquinas's view to be. I could be wrong about that. Compatibilism is a view you hear a lot as like a kind of intermediate, a middle ground, and I've always struggled to sort of pin it down, because I guess it depends on what people mean by compatibilism. Sometimes people mean that sort of at this base level, God determines everything, but we can still sort of speak of free will in a certain sense. And here I feel like a lot of people just are playing. I'm thinking of Jonathan Edwards and others like that. They're sort of like redefining free will to mean something else. You know, as long as you're doing what you want, that's free will, even though what you want is entirely determined by things outside of you. So I don't find that a coherent view of free will. I don't think that's really free will. I think that's just determinism sort of being disguised.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
My understanding of the Thomistic view is they want to have this sort of radical. There's this creation is like radically dependent on God in the way that you have author to book, and I hear that analogy a lot. So God is like the author, and we are like the characters in the book. And so we can meaningfully say that, like in Lord of the Rings, Frodo is the one who is going to destroy the ring, but also Tolkien is the one who's causing Frodo to go destroy the ring. And both are true. They're just happening at different levels of causation. But that seems to me, and I discussed this in my videos, that just seems to me, when you press on it, to sort of, it can collapse into determinism if you press it a little bit. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, I'd be curious to read more and see what Aquinas.
Yeah. Do you mind if I just say something real quick with this, bro?
Yeah.
That's actually really fascinating. And again, I know Aquinas gets claimed by a lot of different people.
Yeah.
I want to be careful to not speak too much on that which I know not to the fullest extent. I do know that Aquinas, though, also gives images of God's foreknowledge that are similar to Boethius. So he does give like one image of like, you've got a watchtower, and basically God is like the sergeant or the army personnel on top of the watchtower looking down at the army marching. And so he sees it all at a glance, right? So he sees it in like one flash. So it gives this notion of seeing across space and time. And so I just wonder sometimes if people like Aquinas, I definitely think this is true about Wesley, and we can get into this, but I think ultimately, even in like forms of Molinism or Arminianism, it's not a problem if we use it in an anachronistic sense to say, so we experience time this way. So then to us, if we live in time was, time is, time will be, it comes across as though, that I think that menu analogy is really solid, or the dog and being let off the leash analogy. But that it's not solid if we live in a time was, time is, time will be reality. But if God perceives it from a different sense, then maybe us or even St. Thomas is using language that's anachronistic in a sense. That would be my reflection, my initial reflection. But again, I'm not like I'm not like an extraordinary scholar when it comes to exactly how St. Thomas parses this out. I know he gets claimed by a lot of different people. I will just say, in my mind, I usually think in meta narratives. I do think that Boethius, I think that Aquinas is basically a son of Boethius theologically when it comes to this question. And then I think, I think ultimately the Carolingians and even like the modern Vatican, I think are then sons of this same type of line. That's kind of my like meta narrative reflection. But anyways, I'll pause here and let you go back to Aquinas.
No, totally. I guess I'll just say when I respond to compatibilism here, maybe I'm just sort of responding to compatibilism, like Thomistic compatibilism as it's been appropriated by Calvinists. So maybe that's different than what Aquinas himself taught. So the problem with this sort of two layers view, you might imagine the author to the book, or the like, I like to think of like a video game console to the video game, right? The entire video game world is being sustained moment to moment by the console, right? And so I think the problem with that is that when we zoom into sort of like, we can think of this in two layers. So layer one is the outside reality, so like the author or the console, right? And there's the inner reality of the actual created world. When we zoom into that, like our reality, our created world, we still have to ask, like, what actually causes a person to choose A rather than B? And what I've heard from a lot of Thomists is like, well, a person chooses A rather than B depending on what their intellect perceives as being better. But then that just begs the question, okay, why does their intellect perceive A rather than B as being better? And you can just sort of do this regress. And at the end of the day, either that person is a first cause, they have libertarian free will, and they themselves are contributing something to that choice, or they're not, in which case you have determinism anyway. And so that's just how I would press that view. And I would just ask what the person means when they say that, what they believe about what is causing a person to choose A rather than B within time, as it were. I do think that matters.
That's really interesting, man. I'll be honest. I want to be careful to not speak too much on what I know not there. That's really interesting because I love Aquinas's 5 ways. And I think about that a lot when it comes to philosophic, arguments for God's existence. I've never thought about that regression in line with thinking about compatibilism like you just shared. That's really I have to think about that a lot more, to be honest. But that's interesting. I've never even heard those two things connected. But anyways, do you want to go ahead and keep going, brother? You can either keep talking about Aquinas here, or do you want to kind of move back to, so you're struggling through these different, the different things that these views hinge upon. And then why did that lead you to where you are now? Like what were some of the things that kind of, that made this new view that you have more coherent, even though really it's an old view? You kind of want to talk about that journey a little more?
Yeah, I think I was wrestling with these things. We've kind of covered the options that I sort of reject or I don't find satisfying. The thing that I was really thinking about this, and the thing that made it click for me is just this concept that you hear about sometimes, that something can be logically prior to something else without being temporally prior to something else. So it can be prior in, like, it can be the logical cause of something without being before it in time. And that's a tricky concept to grasp, but once you sort of wrap your mind around it, I think it makes a lot of sense of this. The example I like to give is like, math equations. You might think of, like, if I write a math problem for you, the solution is sort of logically dependent on the equation, the problem, right? There's sort of a logical dependence there. It follows from the problem I gave you, but it's not logically dependent. It's not dependent in time. It's not like it comes afterwards in time. Mathematical truths are always true. They're eternal, sort of outside of time. So there's sort of a logical dependence there. Sorry if that analogy is confusing, but I think this is what Boethius is sort of saying about how God is outside of time. So in Boethius's vision, and there's a couple of analogies we could use here, but he imagines that God is seeing all of time the way we see the present moment. So you can call it God's eternal now. I think that's what C.S. Lewis calls it. So just like in this present moment, I can observe things that I am causing, like my hand moving. I'm causing that and I'm observing it. but I can also observe things without causing them. I can observe you there, you're moving, you're saying certain things. I can know about things without causing them. So in time, in God's sort of eternal present moment, which for him is all of time, he can see things without being the cause of them. So he can perceive people making free choices and let those choices be truly free and know about them, right? And because he's seeing all of eternity at once, he knows all things. His knowledge doesn't change from moment to moment like ours does. But yet he is not the cause in this sort of deterministic way that we identified before as being problematic. So that would be my view. That's the view that sort of made it click for me and made it make sense.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's difficult to like wrap your mind around, something being, logically before.
Yeah.
But that, again, to reiterate, our choices, our free will choices are kind of like first causes in my view, and they're logically prior to God's knowledge of them, but they're not temporally prior. So God is outside of time. He knows all things always. But he didn't cause our choice. We caused our choice and we were responsible for it. So that's kind of how I'm cashing it out.
Yeah, that's so interesting, man. So, okay. I know I've said this a few times. First off, everybody, welcome to the live stream. This is my friend Alex from Saints and Saguaros YouTube channel. If you have not checked out his channel, definitely check it out. And keep in mind that a sub to his channel can also help like his ministry grow. And I think your thoughts here are so fascinating, man. I find a lot of kinship with this. So the way I think about it, man, for one, what's fascinating to me is even though you said you just moved into Anglicanism, I want to say your methodology here is actually a very Anglican one, and maybe it's because you're drawing from C.S. Lewis, which is interesting. C.S. Lewis is a great example of what an English mind kind of looks like. But so I guess the way I think about it is I always think of like pillars that cannot be crossed with these sorts of questions because we are pondering into a great mystery, right? And so to me, one of the pillars is I totally reject this notion that God can cause evil. I think that's so just outside of the bounds, honestly, for me. And I know people have ways of nuancing that. And I know there's entire traditions that, but I just, to me, that's like a pillar. And another pillar is I think the whole meta narrative of God's creative reality of creation, it all and the whole of the scriptures, I think, necessitates some sort of human. You're using free will libertarianism as the language there. Some sort of real. When I say autonomy, I don't mean autonomy outside of God's grace. So I'm not talking, do you know what I mean, about autonomy outside of God's grace? But there's got to be some sort of human ability to actually make a yes or a no choice. And so I hold these things in tension, and I go, how do I make sense of this? And I'll be honest, when I was growing up, I grew up in a Methodist church, so in the Wesleyan tradition. I didn't really think through all these questions. But I think what's also been helpful for me, one of the professors at my seminary said this, and you can actually still find this video. It's out there on YouTube. It's called 7-Minute Seminary from Asbury Theological Seminary. But he connects, he walks through a lot of these distinctions. And then he, again, connects Einsteinian physics with Boethius, with Wesley. And I just find that to be absolutely like with the prayer book as well. At some point, I think maybe that's maybe I'm collapsing two videos here, but to me, that helps me make sense of it. Where it's like, to some degree, I think we have to recognize that time and space does not work in a linear reality, and if it does, I can see why people will Calvinist or strict Arminian camp. But like you've said, both of those have real serious conundrums and problems. And the only way I can resolve it, in my mind, and I think this is exactly what St. Boethius does in the Consolation of Philosophy. He says, God cannot be the author of evil, but he's reasoned very similar to exactly what you're saying. And I know you're a son of Boethius here, so you're drawing from him. But then he says, but if God knows all these different options, then isn't he still choosing? And then he says, so he must be outside of space and time where we have real ability to choose. It's not determinism, but God is still truly he knows all things. He removes open theism. And then he says, and the only way we can make sense of that is to say God is in all time synonymously at once. So he knows because he's in all time, but each moment then still has real integrity. And what's fascinating about that, bro, is to me, again, it's not that science solves all those questions, but what science does is it shows us, like, even within our modern cosmos, our known cosmos, that time is actually not a constant linear reality, but that time actually bends around gravity. So like if you're watching a science fiction movie, right, and you've got a spaceship here and a spaceship here, and then there's a black hole back here, excuse me, let's say a spaceship here, another spaceship here, and then a black hole over here. If one spaceship leaves and goes closer to the black hole and then comes back around and reunites with the original spaceship, time has actually elapsed differently for the two spaceships. And we think that's like Star Trek, but that's actually real life. And that's just a known entity in our cosmos. And so to me, what that says is it shows how time and space actually bend. And in historic Christian doctrine, we see this all the time. This is how at least Anglicans or traditional Catholic minded thinkers would parse out the Eucharist, how we'd parse out justification. I would even say how Marian things can be parsed out, how we parsed out all sorts of different things are parsed off of this same baptism, the notion of how our baptisms unite with Jesus's. They're all centered around this notion of that time and space can bend around moments or kairos realities. And I just think that's the only way to make sense of all the data. And so that's what Boethius is doing. And that's what I hear you doing too, Alex, is you're trying to look at the meta narrative and say, this may seem coherent in some ways, but if you try to shoehorn all of scriptural thinking into this, you're going to end up with a certain paradigm, but it seems off from the meta narrative. And if you take the Arminian line, which sounds great initially, but then you try to shoehorn everything in here, it becomes difficult to make sense of language like, well, then how is this person predestined? Why did God choose Abel and not Cain, right? Why did God choose Isaac and not Ishmael? But if you have the Boethian narrative, it makes sense of the whole thing a lot more. That would be kind of my reflection back. I don't know. Yeah, I do you mind sharing a little bit more about like, so how did that come to bring you existential? How long had you been struggling with this, bro? And then what kind of existential piece did that bring you? And what was it that clicked, like, I guess at the core level? You've already shared some of that, but.
Yeah. No, I love what you're saying about Einstein there. What's so interesting to me is that there are like philosophers that are gonna like, they're often like Molinists. So like William Lane Craig and I believe Alvin Plantinga, that do reject sort of this view of Boethianism, or I call it timeless libertarianism because I feel like it's more descriptive. But anyway,
yeah.
And their challenge is they believe in presentism. They don't believe that all of time exists at once. And they do run into problems when they're dealing with sort of Einsteinian relativity physics. That's the challenge that they get. And so I've always found that interesting. I'm not a physicist, so I'm probably over my head. But the reason, I feel like it just, the more I thought about it, I had been struggling for a long time, like since I was a kid. I can't remember how long exactly, but I've heard, because you hear these things from, Calvinist or Arminian viewpoints, and they are very like troubling. So it's like, okay, God predestined from all eternity certain people to be saved, certain people to go to hell. That just naturally is troubling. And I understand there are ways to like sort of grapple with that, but that was troubling to me, and it's been troubling to a lot of people. And sort of I wrestled with it for a long time, and I was listening to some of the James White, Leighton Flowers debates, and this has brought me a lot of peace. I think I feel, not that I'm right, but this view makes sense to me, and it just has brought me peace about this. And I do feel like I can meaningfully say God is sovereign, not in the sense of exhaustively determining every single thing, and that people genuinely have free will, and that God knows everything. And those three pieces fit together for me in this view. They make a lot of sense. One other thing, sorry, if I could just mention this real quick. I feel like a huge point of confusion in these debates is we mix views about like questions about what the nature of free will is with questions about how salvation works. So I think we really first need to establish what is free will, how does it work, and sort of the metaphysics of that. You need to first sort of establish that, and then ask questions about how is this free will involved or not involved in salvation? Because I've seen people sort of mix those two debates together, and you get a very tangled mess. And so I'm really trying to just separate those two questions. We're just right now asking what is free will and how does it work in relation to God's will.
Well, do you want to share a little bit there, bro? Or here, let me just say something real quick. And then do you want to share your view of basically how, and if you feel comfortable, how do you kind of reconcile some of those questions? So I'll give just two quick examples. One, I've been thinking a lot recently because I've been thinking a lot about Marian dogmas and doctrines. And I think about St. Paul's language that the Christian is predestined, called, justified, and glorified. This is definitely a text that Calvinists would use, right? Or that, people who claim like that, I think Augustine's a little bit more complicated personally, but you know what I mean? They'll kind of claim an Augustinian framework here. Although I think Boethius and, a Thomas, again, Augustine's a little more complicated. But anyways, this notion of predestined, called, justified, glorified. Well, if you have that God's outside of space and time, but that he also allows real choice within each, there's real integrity in each moment, then something like somebody being predestined and really choosing to respond to their call starts making sense, because they're predestined in a sense because God knows already what they're going to do, because he's in both times at once. But that doesn't mean that their choice doesn't have real responsive grace. So I think of Mary, right? She can be predestined, and then her fiat is still real. Be it done to me according to thy word. That's still real, right? And then Mary's actually a beautiful type for this: predestined, called, justified, glorified. But I think we see this across the Christian life. And the other thing I would just note is when we get into questions about justification, I personally am convinced that this is the way to reconcile this timelessness reality, because like the way N.T. Wright talks about it, and the way St. Richard Hooker talks about it as well, is that the future, in a sense, this is N.T. Wright, but I think it fits with Richard Hooker. The future actually comes back into the present to set us right. So the future, the final declaration, comes back to set you right in the present. And yet, to get to the final, you still actually have to do things, because the final is still based off of the life lived. That's N.T. Wright. And that makes no sense if you hold a strictly like time was, time is, time will be kind of framework, I think. But it makes total sense if you hold this timelessness view, because then what goes on is, again, grace can move across time in a sense like that, because that's God's prerogative. And so he sets us at peace, and yet he still knows where we'll get, but getting there still requires us assenting or cooperating with the Holy Spirit throughout life. And so then either we're cooperating with the Holy Spirit or we're rejecting the Holy Spirit. This is C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce put into action. You're either saying yes to the Holy Spirit or you're saying no to the Holy Spirit throughout your life. But it makes sense. So in Richard Hooker, he says, in a sense, I prefer the word imparted, but Richard Hooker uses the word imputed. He says, in a sense, grace is imputed, although again, I would use imparted. And he says, in a sense, it is bestowed by habitual and real infusion. And that's in the laws of ecclesiastical polity. Well, that's the debate right there. Is grace infused in your soul, or are you just imputed as right? And Anglicans have oftentimes kind of held those together, but that only makes sense if you have the cross space-time reality that God is synonymously present across time. That's been some of my reflections. I don't know if that, if you have any thoughts on that, or if you wanted to go somewhere else with it. But those are two things that I think it shows how this question hinges upon these larger questions.
Yeah, I love that. I've heard you say that before, and I think those are beautiful thoughts. Like this idea that the elect, the predestined, are God in his timeless sight eternally knows them and loves them, and he has this eternal relationship with them. And so we can say truly those are his chosen, his beloved, and yet there is in time this sort of there's this real choice that we make, and it really is causative. We really have free will. We really are responsible. And you were talking about forgiveness. Yeah, like I think about this. I don't know if you'd say it this way, but in some sense, forgiveness is treating a person as they will be, right? Treating a person, regarding a person as they will be one day, right? And
That's
so
interesting.
Justification is kind of reaching forward into that future moment. Treating a person as they will be, not as they are, right?
Would you agree that makes no sense, though, if time was, time is, and time will be is the whole of the reality? It only makes sense if God is in various times at once. Like, I guess that's my contention.
Yeah, in particular, those questions of predestination are really hard to make sense of, in my view, and hold on to. There's real genuine choice, and people really are predestined. I think those are hard to hold on to at the same time if you don't hold to a sort of Boethian view.
Yeah, that would be my reflection. I just want to say this real quick too, bro, just from the comments. My boy Papist 23. What's up, man? It's great to have you back in the chat, by the way. So I know you're a big Augustine double predestination guy. We would have to hash this out more. I guess my insufficient 2-second reflection would just be, I don't know if you were here when I said this earlier. I do wonder though, because again, different people claim Thomas. So like, again, there's a whole book out there, which is fascinating. People can look it up on Amazon, that connects Wesley and Thomas. And I want to say that Wesley is the son of the Carolingians, who really are drawing from Boethius, and that so is Thomas. So I guess my 2-second reflection here would be, I wonder sometimes though, if when they're speaking, I think it sounds anachronistic to, I think it sounds a certain way to us because we live in a different theological age. But I wonder too, just like I think Wesley speaks anachronistically, I don't think, like, we can speak of God will know that, or, Arminian comments are oftentimes meant to be understood anachronistically. It's not how God experiences them, it's how we can make sense of them. So it's an analogical reflection, not a univocal with how God experiences it. I would contend, again, this is an insufficient answer that I can't fully back right this second. It would take a lot to go into the actual Summa to wrestle with this. But I would contend that I think a lot of times in Augustine's writing and Thomas, that there's some anachronistic thinking going on, even with their language, right? Where they're speaking in a way that makes sense to us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's how God experiences it. That would be my 2-second reflection.
Yeah, if I could add a comment, I would say, I think it's really important, again, to distinguish this question of how does free will work versus how does free will work in salvation. So you could still say, I think, you could hold to a Boethian understanding of free will. There's real libertarian free will. And also say in sort of, you could also say that, but there is no free will in relation to salvation because of, depravity and these other reasons. So you could hold to something like Calvinism or unconditional election or Augustinianism while still believing there is real libertarian free will in other realms. Again, that's just sort of separating those two questions of what is free will and how does it work versus how does free will work in salvation. So that would be my thought.
Sorry, bro. I'm trying to sit back here. Sorry, I'm trying to type in this thing. I'm very unsophisticated. I'm such a neophyte when it comes to computers, guys, and live streams. I still haven't even figured out how to pull up stuff quickly. Alex, you're gonna have to forgive me, bro. I'm so sorry. I kind of spaced. Do you mind saying that one more time? Because I want to follow along with it so better than I did there.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, I just I was making the point that I think you can sort of separate questions of like what is free will and how does it work versus is free will involved in salvation. So I could say, for example, that I'm a Boethian and I believe in sort of libertarian free will and divine timelessness, but I don't think that free will is involved in salvation. Like, for example, that sin, because of depravity, we actually can't choose in matters of salvation. And so unconditional election is true. So you could hold both of those at the same time. You could say that, we have real libertarian free will, just not in choices related to salvation, for instance. So I'm just trying to separate the two issues.
Would that be your view, Alex? Do you take that kind of parsed out view?
I would, I don't know. I think it's
yeah. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, bro.
Yeah.
I know you're kind of sharing reflections back and forth here.
Yeah, I think I think I feel like very settled and firm on this question of like Boethianism, timeless libertarianism. I feel more flexible on questions of soteriology. I do tend to think that there is such a thing as depravity, that like Christ, the Spirit has to move first and sort of work first in our hearts before we can be drawn to Him. But I don't know. Yeah, those are interesting questions.
I mean, so in my mind, and tell me again, tell me your thoughts here. I'm actually really curious. So in my mind, I don't think it's a question that humanity has to have God act first. I guess you have to keep in mind though, I like swim in Wesleyan waters because that's just that was my whole worldview. Yeah. But to me, it's totally coherent. So the question for me is, of course, God acts first, but then we cooperate with our response. And to me, that for me solves that question right there, where it's like prevenient grace is out in the world working just in general. I'd say this also fits. This is going to get really complicated. This also fits depending on how we view vincible versus invincible ignorance working, right? Because I think some responses people could give to, what I'm about to say is, well, but then why did God's grace work in the life of somebody like, let's say, who's born in a Christian nation, who grew up in a Christian family, with much easier ability to respond than, somebody who grew up in the Middle East in a Muslim family and didn't necessarily have that same ability to respond? And I guess my initial disposition would be God has ways of working over salvation. But I also think there's extra, like, we are judged upon how we respond in our conscience. So vincible versus invincible ignorance is a major, major category in my mind for kind of that needs to be at the heart of how we parse these things out. But I guess overarchingly, just the meta narrative for me is, of course, God's prevenient grace is out in the world, drawing all men to him. And so God is moving first. And sometimes he works in unique and special ways. Again, I'm not saying there's no mystery here. There is definitely mystery. But then we are still required to respond in cooperation, because I think if we lose that linchpin of thought, the whole narrative doesn't make much sense to me. Then it becomes about, again, to me, it always comes back to, I think C.S. Lewis's analogy of a robot is really good. I know that's a very basic one, but it's like, ultimately there has to be real response or you're a robot. Like, there's no way around that in my mind. Or I love using the better analogy in the modern world is like an AI girlfriend, bro. Like, if you want like a real relationship, it has to have the potential to go wrong, because somebody has to choose to love you back, right? Rather than a programmed reality. So I know those sound so simple, but to me, I think those are barriers that can't be crossed. But tell me if I'm missing something with what you're saying. And I know you weren't committing yourself there to that view. But I guess that's my kind of Wesleyan reflection, is prevenient grace goes into the world. If we're going to say, well, then why doesn't it touch this group? I would say, well, do keep in mind, invincible ignorance versus vincible ignorance is still a real category. Perhaps God can still redeem these people based off of what they did respond to. That's known to the mind of God. But yet God is still working in the world to try and draw all men to himself. But he also wants us to cooperate throughout the whole history of humanity. And to me, just the whole thing makes sense if we put it together that way. Yeah. But I don't know what your reflections would be there, Alex. I'm going to try to look this up while you're responding this, by the way.
Yeah, those are tough questions. I think I would definitely hold to sort of the resistibility of God's grace, that God's grace can ultimately be resisted and rejected. So I would hold that. I think that with prevenient grace, there's sort of this question of, is it true that every single person, is it universally possible for every single person to be saved? Like, they could have been saved if they had made some choice. And I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that question. I think it sounds harsh to say that there might be some people out there who genuinely never had a chance, right? They never had a chance to be saved. I don't think that, even if that's true, that some people never had a chance to be saved no matter what they did. I don't think it's, obviously they still sin, so they're still ultimately responsible in some sense. And I don't think it's ultimately metaphysically true that they never had a chance. It's still the case that the fall was a free will choice, and that it didn't have to happen that way. And that if there are people like that, they are sort of lost in view of the fall. I don't know. I guess I don't know if any of those people exist. I'm open to it. But it might not be the case. It's a very harsh view to say, oh, there are some people that just are out there and never had a chance, but I don't know,
Yeah. I mean, I think all Orthodox Christians, obviously, to be an Orthodox Christian, we do have to say Jesus is the only way to salvation. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And I would say as well, there's no salvation outside the church. Now we have to parse out what that means, because I would hold the line basically that Vatican II holds, just through an Anglican paradigm. That I think Vatican II, in my mind, is like one of the greatest documents ever written. But when it's actually a very, I'm side noting here, it's a very, very Anglican document. And I mean that so respectfully to our Roman brethren. But Vatican II there's actually a book called The Anglican Mind of Pope Benedict, which is fascinating. But it's a very Anglican document in the way that it parses out this notion. I don't know, are you familiar, Alex, with the three camps in Anglicanism? The essay view, the plene essay view, and the bene essay view of church polity.
Yeah.
I don't know what camp you'd find yourself within, or if you've even worked that out. But at least as far as for myself, being a plene essay person, that's basically what Vatican II is doing. And so it still leaves ultimate mystery to God, right? And ultimately God makes the discernment. but there is a sense in which I would have very strong categories for the grace that God can give and can work outside of the normative means to draw men to salvation. That's just my intuition and my disposition, but I can't say that with certainty, right? So I can hope that God can work in different people's lives. I guess I don't necessarily feel the need to be the arbiter of that. So, like, well, who will this happen with and who won't it? I think ultimately we have to say this is known to the mind of God. There's a reason why the church has a list of saints, but not a list of the damned. There's no church list of the damned, right?
Yeah.
There's only lists of the saved. And what we ultimately have to do is commend people to God. And I think, and just in my mind, just through genuine like reflection, I do think that levels of culpability do deeply matter based off of the grace they responded to. And I see this on all sorts of meta narrative, like meta levels, right? Like we could talk about the non-Christian person who lives, on North Sentinel Island or something like this, who's had no contact with humanity or very little over thousands of years. And we can talk even about like, well, what do I do with my Presbyterian friend who I think gets so much right, but I still don't think they have apostolic succession. So then do they have a valid sacrament? So do they receive the normative means, right? Like, and I guess just my general disposition is trusting, like I still see God at work in people's lives in so many ways. And I think that has a lot of meaning. Now, where we have to make a distinction though, is that does not mean then that we are okay to just be wherever. Like if you're convinced in your conscience, like, hey, this is the way, then you are required to respond. And I know that may seem like a riff from the question of omniscience, but I actually think they go hand in hand in my mind, because it's kind of like the overarching meta narrative of your theology. Like, I don't know, Alex, if you have any reflections on this. In my mind, and I mean this so respectfully, but in my mind, most Reformed thinkers, and you see this sometimes in the Lutheran world too, you see this in the German world and in the Reformed world, and you see it in certain Roman Catholic camps as well, although not all of them. They almost think like modern science does. Like they start with the building blocks and then they move up to try and like build up a tower. Whereas the English model was always to start, like N.T. Wright talks about this. You start with the story and with the meta narrative. And then all of these other questions, the question is not, the question is not like this is why Reformed people will battle back and forth about like, well, here we've got Romans 9, this, and we've got this. And I'm not saying that's not important, but English people think differently. They usually start with a coherent story, and that includes your view of God's omniscience. And then from there, all of these questions are like icons or windows into a larger reality. And so ultimately, sometimes we have to change our meta narrative if things show, because that could be a danger in that direction. We have to be willing to change our narrative if certain things don't fit in it. But I think it's just a different way of approaching the question. And I that's just the way my mind thinks. I usually start with the meta narrative and then move from there. But I actually think that helps rather than starting with the building blocks and building up. I don't know if you have reflections there. And then after you're done, I have the Summa pulled up here. I thought maybe we could hop into this question my friend brought up.
Yeah. I'm still, I feel like I'm a very analytical type person. And so I'm trying to like grasp this like narratival way of thinking. C.S. Lewis very much thinks that way. Like, he does.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis obviously did not write a systematic theology anywhere, as much as I wish he had.
Yeah.
He wrote stories, and through those stories, we learn about his theology, right? And
it's a great comment.
Yeah, I still think like my brain is like thinking analytically about these questions. So like, is it the case that all those who are not explicitly Christians are damned? And then I would agree with Vatican II, not necessarily, right? But there's a separate question, is it the case that everybody who is not explicitly a Christian has the opportunity to be saved? That's a different question. And I don't know. Yeah, that's where I wrestle a little bit, but that would be a separate question.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it does require humility, this question to hop into, because to some degree, we can only know so far. Right. And so I think all theology to some degree is this, and certainly these more like, how do I say this? Just these very like, these very lofty questions, right? Around God's mind, God's omniscience. How does God experience time? How does salvation work? how does God judge the heart of all men based off of, what they did know and didn't know, what they responded to, what they didn't. To some degree, I think we have to be really careful to make judgments about all of this. Now, we do want to call all people to the normative ways of this occurring. But then I also want to say, I really think we have to have a tiered system of you know, this makes, I hope this doesn't sound unfair or like I'm being an elitist here, right? But so let's just say, like, up here at the top tier, you've got the visible church. So for me, that's like all the great apostolic traditions are on this top tier. But then let's say, like, below that, you've got churches that like definitely have sacramental theology. They've got presbyteral succession. They've got some notion of the liturgy. They've got, some claim to historicity. Like, let's say the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, they're kind of there for me. And then let's say, like, okay, next for me would be like a historical Baptist, somebody like Gavin Ortland, somebody who has deep knowledge in church history. They're closer, but they're still not quite to the knowledge in my view of like where the Lutherans would be or the visible church. And then you've got non-denominational Christianity that still has valid baptisms. They get lots right. And this is, I'm not trying to just rank everybody here, but okay, so you've got that. Then let's say, like, okay, now let's step outside of Orthodox Christianity. You've got like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Where are they at in comparison to Muslims? We could ponder into that, but I think they're probably closer. But then you've got like, well, I think Muslims and Jewish people are certainly closer than like a Hindu or like a Buddhist. But then ultimately, a Hindu or a Buddhist might be closer than somebody who's just like, got a nasty naturalist kind of worldview. And I'm not trying to degrade anybody. There are naturalists who can still do good kind of things because of God's prevenient grace. But my point is, we have to have kind of a tiered way of looking at reality. And so I don't know where I was going with all that, bro. I guess I'm just saying that, like, people are responding in different ways. And there is a sense in which I think we can have more confidence about a group that's higher up on the tier. But ultimately, when we want to call all groups to the normative way that we believe is the way that God brings about salvation. But I think we at least have to have those categories. And so for me, like, I guess I don't have like deep fear in my heart for Lutherans without apostolics, without visible episcopacy. Like, I think they should get there. And I think it's really important. And I believe that's the normative way to salvation. But I don't feel like a deep sense of fear for them. But I'm much more concerned about people who are not within Christianity. Although even people who are not within Christianity, even though I'm not saying good things get you to salvation, I guess I would just say, like, I do see different levels of people responding to that which they know. And that gets very complicated. But to me, it's a mystery. But we can still say salvation is only through Christ. There's no salvation outside the church, these things. But that means that all men receive salvation through the church and through Christ. But we have to leave that judgment to God. But at least the way that I practically respond to different people in different situations will be based off of how high up I think there are in the level of understanding or grasping. Sorry, bro, that was a little bit of a riff, but I don't know if that, if you have any reflections there. But
yeah, no, that all sounds great.
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. Well, let's go ahead and get back to here. I'll read this from our friend. I don't know if you want to share any reflections here or whatnot, but then did you have more you wanted to ponder into about Boethius? Because I know we kind of went on a little bit of a side trail there. About him particularly before we get into other doctrinal questions that hinge upon this?
Yeah, up to you. I'm not sure how much time you have. I'm pretty much free, but
I'm good. My kids are watching a movie right now, so
awesome.
So I'm chilling. Yeah. And my wife's out of state. So cool. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and read this. Papist 23, my friend, if you're still with us, tell me if I'm getting the wrong thing here, but I think this is the top part of the Summa you brought up. So I'll just go and read this. So this is, if you know how the Summa works. So question 23 is on predestination. Article 1, whether men are predestined by God. Objection 1. But then he gives his response to the objection. So objection number 1 is, it seems that, so this is not Aquinas's view. This is an objection that he receives, and then I'll read Aquinas's view. It seems that men are not predestined by God, for Damascene says, de fide, I think it's Orthodox 230, it must be borne in mind that God foreknows, but does not predetermine everything. since he foreknows all that is in us, but does not predetermine it all. But human merit and demerit are in us, for as much as we are the masters of our own acts by free will. All that pertains, therefore, to merit or demerit is not predestined by God, and thus man's predestination is done away. Okay, so that's the objection and his reply to it. So this is then St. Thomas giving his reflection. Damascene, and I think Damascene is St. John of Damascus, isn't it? I think that's who he's talking about. I think so. But Damascene calls predestination an imposition of necessity after the manner of natural things, which are predetermined towards one end. This is clear from his adding, he does not will malice, nor does he compel virtue, whence predestination is not excluded by him. If that's what you're talking about, man, I'd have to really think about this. I don't initially hear that as necessarily contrary, though, to what St. Thomas thinks in terms of things moving towards a telos, right? So and this will come up when we get into the Eucharist, but I just had a great dialogue with my friend, Roman Catholic scholar, Dr. Brett Salkeld. And one thing he said that was really fascinating is he said, the telos of man is not something other than man, but the telos of bread is body. Because when we eat bread in our physical lives, it ultimately goes into our bodies and helps build our bodies. So the telos of bread is other than itself, whereas the telos of man is not other than itself. That's really interesting. The telos of man obviously is a glorified state reflecting the triune God. It's still ontologically, though, we're still men ontologically, whereas bread ontologically has a different telos. I know that's within St. Thomas's thinking, and he gets into that here. I'd have to really think about this, how though, I don't know if you have any reflections there, but I'm not sure that has to ipso facto mean that he thought that God, because something has a telos, that God had to predetermine its outcome. I think he can still say that the outcome that I will, the telos that I will, is this. I don't, but that doesn't necessarily ipso facto mean that God had to make that come about for each individual person. I still think he can be. I still think he could be in the past, present, and future all at the same time, so he can know the telos, but still allow integrity in the moment. That's where I get into questions of anachronism. I don't know if you have any reflections there, bro.
Yeah, I mean, I have not studied Aquinas extensively on this question. I definitely should. The way it sounded to me was kind of like the Calvinist answers that I always heard, that I was always very frustrated by, is like, oh, God predestines everything in this very deterministic sort of way. Oh, but he's not responsible for evil. And we're not going to say why. He's just not, right? And that's kind of how it came across. I don't know if that's what he was saying, but
I don't, that's not what again, I'd have to really, Article 3 is what he's pointing out here.
Okay.
I'd have to think about this a little bit more. Okay, so here it is. Here's the one he's bringing up. Sorry, Article 3, Objection 1 and Reply 1. Sorry, I was reading Article 1. Objection 1, it seems that, so this is not Aquinas's view. This is, again, for those watching, if you know how to read the Summa, it's super complicated, but he gives objections of other people, then he gives some thoughts, and then he responds at the bottom to the objections, and then he concludes. Okay, objection number 1. So this is not Aquinas, but it's one he'll be responding to. It seems that God reprobates no man, for nobody reprobates what he loves, but God loves every man according to wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon in the Deuterocanon. Thou lovest all things that are, and thou hatest none of the things thou hast made. Therefore God reprobates no man. Okay, and then his reply to that. So this is Aquinas. God loves all men and all creatures, inasmuch as he wishes them all some good, but he does not wish every good to them all. So far, therefore, as he does not wish this particular good, namely eternal life, he is said to hate or reprobate them.
Yeah, so God does not will eternal life for all.
I think it's more complicated that, though. I'd have to really think about this, man. So Papist 23, my friend, I hear what you're saying with this, but I guess one thing I would just note, and I'm, again, somebody who generally, if I want to learn something, I turn to the Summa, but I just do want to know, Aquinas does not, like, Catholic teaching, and that's not just Roman Catholicism, capital C Catholic teaching, we're deeply indebted to Thomas. He's the doctor of the faith, but we're not ipso facto required to believe everything Thomas believed. But I also would say, if we're going to think about this, like in response to how Boethius would say it, I think there's another way to read this, though, too. Again, I have to think more before I speak on that, which I know not. But God loves all men and all creatures, inasmuch as he wishes them all good. But he does not wish every good to them all. So far, therefore, as he does not wish this particular good, namely eternal life, he is said to hate or reprobate them. But he said to do that, but that doesn't ipso facto mean, in my mind, that he is saying some people are damned and that you have to read that through a Calvinist lens. I still think there's a way you could nuance that to read it through a Boethian lens. Again, I would have to do more study on this, but I want to claim that Thomas is ultimately a son of Boethius, because Thomas does use Boethian language, which does, to me, give a different angle on this than how we'd read this in the modern world. That would be my just 2-second reflection, but I want to be careful. I don't want to riff too much about one part in the Summa. I'd have to really think about it more than I can just do right here in 2 seconds. Again, though, I would say even here, Alex, I don't know if you see this, bro, but to me, again, the Anglican mind usually starts with meta narratives. And so if I'm reading something like the Summa, I'm trying to make sense of it within this meta narrative, not just argue systematically, okay, we've got this one passage in the Summa and let's lay this out against the Molinist position. I just think about theology differently than that. I think about theology in terms of like, does that make sense with the meta narrative? But if we begin with the meta narrative of Boethius, I think there's a way to read this within that meta narrative. But again, I'd have to go deeper into Thomas than this. And it is possible to just say maybe we don't necessarily agree with Thomas. That's not like totally out of bounds. Although again, my general deference is to Thomas, but I am committed to. I would also say this is true about Augustine. It's pretty hard to say, Augustine is somebody I think we're all indebted to. But I still think it's legitimate to say, hey, I actually think Irenaeus got this particular thing more right than Augustine. Or I think that, this other thinker, Boethius, got this more right than Aquinas or something. That's not like totally out of bounds, but I'd have to think more about Aquinas's view. Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and take the reins while I'm just.
Yeah, no, I would definitely. This is a homework assignment for me. I need to go read more of these passages from Aquinas and study his view a little bit better.
Yeah, me too. I would say anybody watching, a good place of study would be, how does Aquinas pick up off of Boethius? I think that would be really interesting. I will say though, man, because I think this is important though too. And then we can move from here to the other questions. I have a real category in my mind for the development of doctrine. And I realize that for people that can be a very, very slippery slope. But I know we usually think in terms of like everything that's older is better. And there's some sense in which that can be true, right? Like, so the Ad Fontes movement in the 17th century was all about going back and retrieving the fathers because they're closer to the apostolic age. And so we're trying to retrieve them because it's older. So there's definitely a place for that. But there's also a place for, hey, this period of time has thought about this so in depth. And then this period of time has thought about this so in depth. And then this period of time has thought about this other thing so in depth. And so in the modern world, what ends up happening is the strings of truth from all of those are drawn into a deeper, coherent reality. That maybe part of that might sound a little different from how Thomas laid it out, but it can still be indebted to Thomas. So in my mind, that's where I start with like, honestly, the way you've thought through this, Alex, I think is really healthy, where it's like you look at one thing, and if I'm misrepresenting your view here at all, please tell me, but you look at one thing with Calvinism and you're like, okay, well, this makes sense and this makes sense, but I can't, this other part just does not align with what I think God actually does. And then you're wrestling with Arminianism and you're like, okay, this sounds great and this sounds great, but is this actually what aligns with what the Bible teaches? And what about these other problems it presents? And it still presents these meta-narrative problems of, like you said, Dr. Strange, like, well, if God knows all the things, it's like a menu and in the items on the menu, like which one's greater, right? Like, certainly the one who made the menu could change the menu. That would be just an easy option. So that seems to present problems for Molinism or Arminianism. And so then it leads you to, okay, how do I bring out a coherent thought from all of this? And sometimes across history, that's happening too, where it's like certain people we look at in the past and really revere. Like I'll give a totally different example, bro, and then I'll let you go from here. And then from there, I think this could just naturally lead us into discussion about the Eucharist or whatever other doctrines we want to talk about that this hinges upon. But this is going to seem out of left field. I don't know if you've heard me talk about this, Alex, but to me, this totally makes sense, this type of thinking. So Saint Jerome, who's one of the four doctors of the Latin Church, right, of the Western Church, is absolutely unequivocally somebody that we're indebted to. But in Austin, if we were to really go into Saint Jerome's views on marriage and intimacy between husbands and wives and these kind of things, I don't think that what he's sharing is nearly as theologically rich or theologically informed as I think St. John Paul II shares in Theology of the Body. Right. I think St. John Paul's II articulation of how marriages reflect the triune God is far, far more sophisticated than what I think St. Jerome was doing. But that does not mean that modern theology, that we're still indebted to St. Jerome. And we would be very much so we would be out of bounds to just dismiss Jerome. But we're allowed to take some of the logic of Jerome and all the good from him, and even his good on this particular topic, right? This call to prudence in marriage and calls to having like a hierarchy of loves and these kind of things. We can still take those things and inculcate them into our modern understandings, as I think somebody like St. John Paul II would have done. We can still say that with certain things, deep reflection has led to a very sophisticated view in my mind of how, just relationships basically reflect the Trinity, and that is actually ground in with that's ingrained with God's original design. And so to me, those things are just obvious, but we can do that without discounting the past. I think we can even do that with people like Thomas, or as sophisticated as Thomas is. I don't know about you, Alex. I find very, very, and I know I don't want to upset my friends. I know, my friend here who I've been engaging with now has a different view than me on this. I would say the vast, vast majority of like Roman Catholics today, and certainly of Anglicans, I don't think hold this strict line of like determinism. I just don't. I don't see Roman Catholicism holding that line at all, really. I'd say, well, I shouldn't say not at all, because obviously some people do. But I would say that the core of the trajectory of the Vatican II Church, I don't think holds determinism. And that's actually something where when Wesleyans engage with Roman Catholics, usually the dialogue will be around, well, we basically both agree about soteriology and how God's omniscience works and these kind of things, because there's the heart of the tradition that comes out. But Roman Catholicism is still indebted to Thomas in this. So that's where it's complicated, right? And so I guess I just want to say that I think that I think that's true. Just like I think in Anglicanism, I realize Anglicanism has a reformed heritage to it to a certain degree, but I would say most Anglicans I meet today think in these same sort of terms, that I think I think the prayer book naturally intuits something like Wesleyanism. And I know that might be hard for people to hear, but I think the prayer book just obviously talks about that we have the ability to keep from sinning or to sin, and that is something that we're asking God to do for us, to give us that grace to be able to respond in that way. Anyways, I'll stop there, but that would just be my reflection, I guess, that sometimes we think of new as like not as sophisticated as the old, but oftentimes the new is actually a deep, deep reflection on the old, drawing deep principles out of it, but still being able to develop in a way that's actually more coherent with the original vision of God. That would be my kind of 2 cents.
Yeah, no, those are good thoughts. I think, correct me if I'm understanding you wrong, but I think you tend to see like unity or Catholicity, like a view being widespread as being more of a metric for truth rather than it being new or old. If we see like Anglicans and Catholics coming together to hold a view, that's, that gives the view more credence than the fact that some church father a long time ago held it. I don't know if you would say it that way.
Sort of. I would say that I think it definitely shows a working of the divine logos. So I do think that, so like if the first book I write, man, I'm going to title it a sentence from St. John Henry Newman, that the world judges rightly. Now, what St. John Henry Newman meant by that was that since Rome was bigger, that they judged rightly. What I would mean by that is that I really believe that in the ecumenical movement, to me, this is just as obvious as the fact that the sky is blue. And I mean this respectfully to people who disagree. But to me, you see a convergence around core realities that clearly speak of the core of the Holy Spirit at work. And you can see these lines trace out throughout history of like there's a coherent way of seeing how these things have aligned, and they haven't aligned because one side capitulated and the other side didn't. They aligned because there's a core reality to the dogmatic teachings of various, really serious Christian groups. And this is where you get the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. This is where you get the Windsor statement from Archic on the Eucharist. This is where you get statements on Mary at the core. This is why Rome has changed its language on Mary. This is why we've changed we've opened ourselves up to deeper ways of thinking about some of these things at an official level. This is why, in the 18th century, things are very different. Rome looked at things in a very specific way. Anglicanism looked at it in a different way. Then in the 19th century, we learned things from Rome that we deeply needed to learn. In the 20th century, they learned from us deeply Augustinian principles that signs lead to realities or signs lead to the res. And this kind of thing clearly draws out like and then the 20th century is about hashing all that out. It leads to a core of the reality, but that core of the reality is also old. So I would say the convergence matters, but it's not discounting the old. It's actually bringing the old to its telos, I guess, is maybe a way I would phrase it.
Yeah.
I don't think that I don't know. I'd have to think a little bit more about the exact way you worded that, but I don't want to give the impression too that I'm just like all down for anything modernist if there's agreement, right? So like if groups were to come around and say like, hey, we all agree about this, but the reality is still it doesn't align with the core of Scripture and the core of the Christian tradition, then I would not be able to say that, oh, that's fine. But what I would say is that what I really believe is that the Holy Spirit brings deeply old things in line as the divine logos is at work. I guess that's the way I just envision it. I see it happening. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So what would you say, bro? Do you mind if we get into the Eucharist a little bit? Because I know this is a place where I know you've put out some videos that I would see it differently from that perspective. And I think maybe this is where you said you wanted to get into this. So I would hold that I do believe that transubstantiation can be reconciled with the historic Anglican view. And I would basically argue from that based off of these conversations of space and time we've been having. And then also how I think that at time, so obviously the Reformation is responding to something and they're rejecting something. I just contend that they're not rejecting Thomas. They're rejecting the view that people had of Thomas, which was inaccurate. And then what's dogmatized at Trent is Thomas himself. And then later on in church history, I'd say pockets of Roman Catholicism persisted in misunderstanding Thomas. And this can be movements like the Neo-Thomist movement at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. But then what Vatican II is it's the Resource Ma movement basically put onto paper. And the Resource Ma movement, figures like Henri de Lubac, are all about restoring Augustinian principles that signs lead to realities, or the signs lead to the res in Latin. And I know you've talked about this on your video a bit, in one of your videos. But so in my mind, that movement of Rome back to to original views of Thomas actually aligns with the Anglican position, because the Anglican position was rejecting a false understanding of Thomas. That would be my basically contention. But I'll let you kind of share from here, like have your like where are your thoughts at with this question right now. And then I thought that might be really interesting. And again, for those watching, how does this deal with God's omniscience? It's a case study of how these questions affect how we view these other dogmas or other doctrines, and how do they change how we might parse them out. So anyways, I'll let you move from there, Alex, but please feel free, where I'd really be interested, like where's your heart at on this? Where's your mind? How's your journey been in trying to discern this question? And how do you view it just as a whole?
Yeah. Man, I really just want to hear from you, because you've probably studied this and thought about this a lot more than I have. I guess I'm coming with, I want to recognize I'm coming with baggage from, my past. So I'm interested to see your thoughts. I guess where I struggle, I would have no problem, articulating a very strong sense of real presence. I know it gets
Mhm.
very technical when we talk about,
Yeah.
substance acts, all that.
Mhm.
I would, probably prefer like a Lutheran articulation, like
Mm.
the Eucharist is both bread and wine and the body and blood of our Lord, and how that is a mystery. That's just kind of what makes sense to me.
Mm.
I don't know if that's in conflict with transubstantiation or not.
I think.
Um,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, bro.
but I think a video I put out sort of like, I still would struggle with the view. There's this sort of very strong upward sense in the Mass that Catholics would hold to, that the act of the priest offering up the Mass is in and of itself a propitiatory sacrifice, that the priest is acting in persona per Christi to offer
Mhm.
Christ to the Father through the Holy Spirit. This is this is a propitiatory sacrifice. It is Christ is immolated in the Mass. They would use that language, I think. I really do struggle with some of that. It just does. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of how would I articulate the objection. Like imagine someone said like Mary is God, and they were saying that, and you'd respond by saying, oh, no, she's not God, right? And Catholics and Protestants agree that she's not God. But that person said, oh, no, she participates in the divine nature. She's one with God, she theosis, right? And who participates in the divine nature more than Mary, right? And so you could sort of defend that language of Mary is God by using the language of oneness and participation.
Mm.
And, I might say, well, yeah, I agree that Mary participates in the divine nature. I agree that she's one with God in a certain sense. And that person might respond, oh, great, then you agree that Mary is God. Like, no, I don't agree that Mary, like the language just seems so problematic that I understand we can construct a orthodox way of understanding that language, but I still don't think the language should be used because it just seems to indicate something problematic. I guess, does that make sense? Does that objection sort of make sense?
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Here would be kind of my reflection on this. I think that's actually really interesting. So I'm reflecting back on the dialogue I just had with Dr. Brett Salkeld, and
I
for
still
those
need to watch
watching,
that, by the way.
yeah,
I
I
watched it.
actually. What's fascinating, it didn't get nearly as many views. I think it's one of the best interviews I've ever done.
Okay.
And basically, what we did is just agree the whole time. And his viewpoint was that
That's
I
why it
was.
didn't get views.
Yeah. But his viewpoint was basically that I don't mean this in a net, but his viewpoint was that I was correct, that there is a way in the work that's been done since Vatican II to say with full-throated reality that our traditions actually officially agree about the Eucharist. His reflection was that corpus is there, even if people are unaware of it. That, like, he talks about Henry Chadwick, who's one, I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He's one of the greatest Anglican thinkers of that time period in the 20th century. And he actually headed up Archic from the Anglican side. And Dr. Selkold talks about how he wrote one of the greatest works on transubstantiation he's ever read. But anyway, so this would be one of my reflections from that dialogue. When I just brought up this notion of what is the telos of something, in your analogy, Mary's telos is not God. So Mary is a creature who, even though she's worthy of deep reverence, do you know what I mean? And veneration, she is not God, and her telos is not God, because there's an eternal ontological distinction between God and creatures, right? And so even though humanity is drawn into the Godhead through Jesus's human nature, right, in a sense, we're drawn in as a reflection, but we still ontologically remain humans. We don't, it's not like, in God's peace to these people, I don't agree with them, but it's not like the Mormon theology, like we don't become God in substance or in essence, right? Of course.
Right.
But so our telos, including Mary's telos, is not God. But I would say the Mass's telos and the Eucharist telos is union with the one reality, which is the cross and the heavenly banquet coming together. So that's where I would draw that distinction, is that the telos of Mary is not God, but the telos of the Mass is oneness with the propitiatory reality of the cross and the eschaton. So that's where I would say there's a distinction. But I guess so, because if I didn't make that distinction, where I was originally going to go with it, I was going to talk about how there's a participation, right? Like, and you alluded to that. Like there's a participation in the cross and there's a participation in the eschaton. And but you would say, but wouldn't that logic then lead to us saying, but does Mary participate because she's participating in theosis? Does that make her equal to the adoration we would give to the Trinity? And I would say the difference there is the telos of the ontological entity we're talking about. And so I would say that the Last Supper, the Eucharist, is ontologically the same as the cross, and we can see that in the Gospels themselves. And then I would say that's different because Mary's telos is not God. So have you heard me talk at all about, bro? I riff about this a lot, but I never know who hears what. Have you ever heard me talk about how the Seder meal is connected with the cross?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Like that in the Seder meal, there's 4 cups. Jesus drinks 3 at the Last Supper. The 4th cup is what he drinks on the cross. So it ontologically unites the reality as one. This is actually the official statement of Anglicanism today, which is interesting, at least in certain circles. So like the Windsor statement basically does say that this is, that there's agreement in substance. And then 20 years later, the work between the USCCB, which is the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, and the Episcopal Church, and again, this is pre-GAFCON, all that. So it would hold, I would say, in GAFCON. There's an official 5-point declaration that's put out in response. And one of the points, I think it's point number 3, explicitly says that Anglicans affirm the propitiatory nature of the sacrifice. And even Sean Luke, fine with, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but he talks about this a lot. Sean Luke's okay with the notion of propitiatory language for the sacrifice. Again, because it's a participation, but I guess that only makes sense if we can delineate the difference between a participation in something that has its telos in the same reality and something that participates without necessarily having a telos of moving to, like Mary's telos is not to become God. Mary's telos is to be drawn into the divine life and reflect the triune God. But there's a very important distinction there. Whereas the Eucharist telos is the one mysterion, which includes the propitiatory cross and the eschaton, the last supper, or the heavenly banquet. And it draws us into the one. What do you think about, do you think that's a fair distinction? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, bro, because I know this is very complicated stuff, but it's as comfortable as you feel talking about it. Do you see that distinction I'm making at all, or do you think I'm missing something there?
Yeah, I definitely need to think about that more. I'd be interested to hear what Sean Luke says about this, because I really I definitely really respect him. I think he's yeah, I'd be interested to hear what he says about that.
Yeah.
I just bump into, I think I understand what you're saying. So Mary, but I mean, I guess, would you say that, because it seems to me the logic of Hebrews, right, is that Christ, our high priest, enters into the Holy of Holies alone and offers up the once for all sacrifice. And oh yeah, that's a good. I gotta remember that
Sorry,
one.
don't let me cut you off, bro. I'm just acknowledging what's in the chat while we're
the logics. In Hebrews it talks even about like the priests, the Jewish priests, stand day after day, but Christ entered in, past tense, offered, past tense, sat down at the right hand of God, right? So he's no longer. The logic isn't, oh, they offer continual sacrifices, but we offer continually the once for all sacrifice, right? That's not the logic of Hebrews. I guess I do struggle with the concept of like that the priest, is the priest identical to Christ? Is he, I know we say he's acting in persona Christi, but what does that mean? Like, is he identical to Christ? Is the mass, offered, every Sunday, is that identical to what happened on Calvary in 33 AD? I just struggle with that concept. It seems to me that it participates in that reality. It's one with it in a certain sense, but it's not identical to it. It's a distinct event. I don't know if that makes sense.
I guess I don't. I would be bound completely to the language of anamnesis, that it's a representation of that one event.
Yeah.
So that it is the same event. Obviously, we participate it in a distinct way, but I would be pulled into that same language. So here's a couple, I guess, just reflections I would give here, man. And I'd be interested on your thoughts on this seriously. So for one, in the Jewish Seder meal, so I would claim when I talk about the convergence of the divine logos, people might not know what I'm talking about. The concept of anamnesis is in my mind the greatest breakthrough of the post Vatican II ecumenical movement. The concept of anamnesis, because it's the Roman Catholics saying that's it's always been our theology, and it's the Protestant Reformation saying that's the theology we were trying to get at all along, and it's the two of them converging. And anamnesis is a Jewish concept. So the Seder meal, in the notion of the Seder meal, they did believe that they were reliving the Exodus, full stop. So this is why, like, during the Seder meal, they'll talk about, like, on this night, it uses language of we're participating in this night. And then there's definitely a belief that it's not some abstract, like, reflection in the past, but it's a true reliving of the reality. I think this is why God sets up the Seder meal in Exodus itself and is so careful about it, because he wants to make a perpetual reality that is lived out. And then from there, even think about it, like, or I would say, like, in the Psalms, it talks about God being the one, I delivered you through the Red Sea. Well, they're being delivered through the Red Sea too. These children of Israel who are participating in the Seder meal, because there's a participation. Now, to your point about Hebrews, I would say that the difference here is in the Old Testament, right? Like, if something happened, again, we experience space and time in a way that makes sense to us, where there is prior, present, and after. In God's eyes, it's more complicated than that, right? And we've already kind of gone into that on a meta narrative level. But I don't representation of the sacrifice is not saying that, like, again, it gets into our concept of justification again as well. How does the future come into the present to set us right? At least I don't know if this is your view of justification, but mine would be that the future comes into the present to set us right, and that we have to keep saying yes, but we can already know that we're right. So in the Old Testament, the sacrifices were to actually make you right again, right? Whereas in this sense, in a sense, we already know that we're right, and yet we still have to respond to it. But I think on a deeper level than all that, because that can leave us in the confusing territory, when I think of how creation works, there is a sense in which the same realities are replayed over and over again. I think it's built into the very framework. So I don't know if you've heard me talk about this at all, Alex, but I am fully convinced now, like fully convinced, that the 7 days of creation are actually the pattern of the 7 days of creation is relived out very, very closely tied to the 7 movements of salvation history. I would say they lay over top of one another, right on top of the other. And then I would say the 7 movements of Revelation, which when I had a dialogue with a friend of mine just recently from Nashotah House, he said whenever he talked to his Ethiopian Orthodox friends, or maybe it was his Coptic Orthodox friends, it was some Oriental Orthodox group, he said, yeah, they said Revelation's about the Mass. That's what it's about, which I thought was really interesting. But Revelation has a 7-fold pattern to it as well, that I would say 1-to-1 lays on top of the 7 days of creation and the 7 movements of salvation history. And then the Mass itself has 7 movements, and the 7 movements of the Mass, which is held across Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Lutheranism, and Anglicanism, they lay 1-to-1 over those same realities, so that, like, day 2 of creation, I can align with the 2nd movement of salvation history, I can align with the 2nd movement of Revelation, and I can align it with the 2nd movement of the Mass. And I can do the same thing with every day. Every single one lines up in a neat chart right down the line. And so what that says to me is, and I'm convinced of that, so what that says to me is that God does work in this notion of, again, it makes perfect sense with Boethian views of space and time, but then it would also make sense of why things can overlay one another like that in God's eyes, how the cross and the eschaton and the present can all participate in one reality. And I don't think that offends against what Hebrew's saying. Anyways, I said a lot there. And again, I really, like, I don't want you to ever feel like when you come on here, like, pigeonholed. Push back, man, whatever, like, share your reflections. If you need to think more, say that. But I want you to feel total, this is a great conversation, man. And I don't want you to also feel put on the spot if you don't feel comfortable reflecting without thinking about it more.
I'm good. I reserve the right to change my mind. So there's my disclaimer.
Yeah, there you go.
Hear that, internet? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good principle.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I was appropriating one of your concepts that you talk about a lot, which is that, the sign and the reality, that
Mhm,
Protestants tend to divorce those two and
mhm,
Catholics tend to collapse those two. And this shows up reflected in a lot of our debates,
mhm,
justification, faith and works,
mhm.
tradition and Bible. And I absolutely think that's true. I was seeing that also happening in the Mass. So Protestants tend to just
Mm,
divorce the reality of Calvary with what is happening in the Mass, right? And just divorce them. We just remember it. It's not really ontologically connected in any way. But my concern is that Catholics collapse the two and they say they are the same. They are identical.
that's
And I would
interesting.
worry about that too. And I would want to have this distinction where we say what happens in the Mass is inseparably one with, yet
Mm,
distinct from Calvary. It's not Calvary. Calvary is not happening every Sunday. Something united to it is happening, but it's not the same. As Christ, divine and human natures, they're intimately one, yet they need to remain distinct. Um,
that's interesting, bro. I have to think about that. Well, in the sign versus reality thing, the mysterion is the res, right? Is the actual thing that's being signified or pointed
yeah,
to. And I would say in the res, the cross and the eschaton and the Eucharistic, the Mass, it's all like the res, it's one. I do think that's interesting to say though. So in that same line of thinking, the inculcation of the res is the sign, and the Mass is the sign. So that's the inculcation of it for us. With that said, though, so I'd have to really think about that. I can still see what you're saying, though, that I do think there's a sense in which we have to say the sacrifice of Christ was one, and it was on the cross, and it was one for us. Depends on when you date the birth of Jesus, but between 29 and 33 AD, right? Like that's when Christ was crucified, and that's when sin, death, and hell are defeated forever. And then the resurrection's a real event that happens at a particular time where we can locate it in history. I do think that's important. um so that's definitely a specific reality. I guess I'm just saying that what the Mass is it's the inculcation of that for us. So
yeah,
obviously the cross is a one-time event, and that's what
yeah,
Hebrews getting at, right? And remember, of course, we I would say we need to, even the scriptures themselves are written so that it makes sense from our perspective of reality, because we do experience time as like that was in the past, this is now, and the future will be the future. So the scriptures are written to make that reality present for us. Obviously, though, in God's reality, it's going to be more complicated than, you know what I mean?
yeah,
It's going to be in a way that we cannot really comprehend, if especially if we hold a Boethian view that he's synonymously present in all time.
yeah,
So we experience before, during, and after, and the scriptures are written to reflect that before, during, and after reality. But again, when we speak of God, he's in a distinct ontological category. So I guess I would just flag that. Um, but I would still say the Mass then is the inculcation. It's the inculcation of the reality for us, and in the reality it's one. So it's the inculcation of the one. So it is, we truly are present at the cross and at the eschaton when we participate in the Eucharist, and yet we can still say that Christ really died once and for all on the cross for the
yeah,
sins of the whole world. I guess that's as far as I maybe feel comfortable probing into it.
yeah,
But that's where I go. I'm not certain that we're saying something that different.
right.
I don't know what your reflections are there. Um, did you hear what I just said is like super different from how you view it, or is it still laced with concerns that you would have?
No, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, here Quay says, what do you think about this comment? He says, Quay's one of my good Roman Catholic friends. Catholics do, I don't know him personally, but as we engage, Quay's always been a faithful supporter. Catholics do not say Calvary happens every Sunday. We would say it is an eternal, timeless event that is entered into at every Mass.
Yeah,
What would your reflections be on that?
yeah, no, I think I get that. I think I understand. I understand what how that view works. I get uncomfortable with the language. It's kind of like that analogy I was using of saying Mary is God and justifying it using language of participation, right? Saying the priest off in persona Christi offers up Christ as a propitiatory sacrifice. That still just makes me uncomfortable because, you know, we could say that we are receiving. Yeah, maybe I'd have to think about it more.
Yeah, no, that's
But
what do you think about the notion? I'll get back to this real quick. What do you think about the notion of the distinction between the telos of an event? So, because again, I would say if we're talking about the sign and the res, the telos of the mass is participation in the res, in the mysterion,
right.
in the one reality, right? Which is the cross and the eschaton and all the altars of all the saints. It's one reality. So that the mass is the participation. So it's telos is that. Mary's telos is not
Right.
is not being God in essence. Mary will always be a creature, right? As will we, but we'll be obviously be drawn into theosis if we, you know, how I would use the Anglican model of parsing that out. But I think there's a lot of overlap with the Eastern view of theosis. I realize we get into essence energies. I'm a Westerner, but anyways, my point is, you know, but what do you think that's a fair distinction, that the telos of something though matters when you're pointing out the difference here?
Yeah, I definitely I want to think about that more. The thought I had, I had a couple thought experiments. So one, imagine, you know, the night Jesus, the night Jesus is going to be crucified, right? He says, all right, you know, Bartholomew, I want you to go act in persona Christi, go offer up the once for all sacrifice, die on the cross in my place. You're my representative. You're acting in persona Christi. Go die for me. Could he have done that? I would say no. I think we'd all say no. And what that means in my mind is that a representative acting in persona Christi cannot offer up the once for all sacrifice on Calvary, right? We can participate in the sense of receiving the fruits of the once for all sacrifice, but someone that's a representative cannot actually offer it. I don't know if that.
So this might seem totally out of left field, but can I throw out a different biblical analogy? And I'd be interested in your reflections here.
Yeah.
So I'm convinced that the sixth movement of salvation history is, excuse me, I'll go here. The sixth day of creation is when obviously God creates the land animals, and then he creates Adam and Eve. And then he gives Adam and Eve the right as image bearers to name the animals. The sixth movement of the Mass is the sacrifice or the oblation. I am convinced that those two things are deeply intertwined. So when Adam is given the ability, sometimes we use the language of like humans are, I want to be really careful with people here, but humans are in a sense co-creators with God as image bearers. So like when we make beautiful art, that the proper theological language, I would say, is that we are being a co-creator with God. That does not mean that we are the same as God with his creative abilities, but because we are created as image bearers, we co-create with God. I think that's the proper theological language, at least that I would contend, and that I've heard. So when Adam is naming the animals, he's not the same as the triune God. He's given the ability as an image bearer, though, to name, and what he names becomes what he names it because God gave him that authority to do that.
Yeah.
In the sixth movement of the Mass, when the priest who's standing in persona Christi is speaking, actually what's going on is he's naming, but it's the Holy Spirit working through him to name that which is on the altar, and then it goes from old creation to new creation.
Yeah.
So he's bringing about new creation by his speech, but it's really God's who's doing that speech. And so God brings realities through his speech. I just want to say, I guess in my, like, I think we see examples of this where, like, again, I think Adam's actually a really good example where God's giving him an authority to do something on the behalf of God, right? And he's co-creating with God, but he's still not God, right? But he's reflecting this reality. I think something similar is going on in the Mass where the priest is speaking and God is making something to be, and the speech is God's speech. But again, so I know that Sean Luke, again, just to give, because people, I'm not saying you're doing this at all, Alex, but people will sometimes, I think, just think like, oh, that's Anglo-Catholic Colin, we can discount him or whatever. Actually, I think this is Sean Luke will contend that a lot of our divines from the Carolingian period, I can't name exactly who, used language of propitiatory sacrifice because of anamnesis, that it's united with the one. I guess what is it exactly, bro? And I'm sorry, maybe you've already answered this to some degree. What is it exactly that makes you super uncomfortable with it? And we may not, completely resolve this right here, and that's okay. I don't want you to feel pigeonholed to give an answer or anything. What is it?
No, I really thank you for taking the time. I was
yeah. This is great, man.
I'm here to learn from you. I guess let me articulate a view. I wonder if you are comfortable with this view. So the way I currently, what I feel comfortable saying, like in the Hebrew, in the Jewish sacrifices, you had, the bringing of the animal, the slaying of the animal, the presenting of its blood on the altar, or maybe in the Holy of Holies. And then you had sometimes the eating of the animal by the participants, right? So the way I have been understanding it, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, is that those first parts, the bringing of the sacrifice, that's Christ himself, the slaying of the sacrifice, the offering of the sacrifice in the Holy of Holies, that is all complete, and we participate in that. We eat of the sacrifice, right? That's the last part of the sacrifice which we participate in. But I think Catholics would say no, it's the offering up of the blood, that's also what we're doing. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that because it just the logic of Hebrews. It just seems to me that the logic is Christ alone is worthy to enter the Holy of Holies and offer up his own self, right, in the heavenly realms. And it just seems to me like we're stepping on Jesus's toes when we say, no, we're also doing that. Does that make sense?
So I think I hear what you're saying. So I'm not a Leviticus scholar, but I'll tell you something my buddy said the other day, which was mind-blowing to me. I think he would have used language a little bit different from what you just used, where he would say there's one more element to the sacrifice that I also think is important. So he would say that the sacrifice, for example, in Leviticus, is you take the animal and you slaughter it, and then obviously its blood is sprinkled over the altar. But then what happens next is they burn the entrails of the animal, and so the incense rises. And then he would say that my buddy, when he was explaining it to me, said the sacrifice is not complete until the priest eats the sacrifice.
Yeah.
So the sacrifice actually goes from the slaughtering of the animal to the priest eating it. Well, we've got the slaughtering of the animal, the cross, right? The sprinkling of the blood, obviously. Then the part where the incense rises is the ascension to heaven. And then from there, the priests who stand in the place of Christ eat the sacrifice. And so then so it's all participating as one kind of thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the cross is not, it's still obviously, again, I still believe sins are forgiven on the cross, but I'm saying that fits with the typology of Leviticus, the ascension and then the eating by the priests. Those I would say would be priests in a sacramental sense, and us as the priesthood of all believers, right? Participating in this. What do you think about that, bro? When he said that to me, I was mind blown. Again, I'm not a Leviticus scholar, so I don't want to speak on that, which I know not, but it made sense to me when he was kind of laying it out to me, one of my very learned buddies.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like I am still learning to read the Bible in a more typological way. In my evangelical life, I was probably very averse to that. I wanted to read in a very, very exegetical way, or like a historical grammatical type way. But I'm still learning all these layers. I actually listen to you a lot to learn a lot of these typological layers that exist in the text, and it's fascinating to learn more about them.
That's very kind of you, man. I really, really want to encourage, again, anybody who was not here at the beginning, check out Alex's channel, Saints and Saguaros. He's got a lot of fascinating stuff there. And so I want to, support you in your ministry as well, because I know you can be a gift to people as they're wrestling through things as well. Yeah, I guess just for me, man, I think I want to be very careful of avoiding language like I think, but I also don't want to give the impression that Alex, if you don't agree with me, you're not a real Anglican. I don't want to give that impression. But I do want to, I'm sometimes a little leery of saying I think, because what I want to say is I believe that what I'm contending for is actually the official discerned position by the Anglican Communion. And the reason why that matters is you've got people who are far more learned than myself sitting down and wrestling through these questions and coming up to certain conclusions for deeply grounded reasons that are not just capitulating on the things that Anglicans held dear. And a lot of that is based off the sign reality stuff. So even, I just want to point this out, when you said something earlier, you said Roman Catholics tend to collapse. I think that was true of the neo-Thomist world of pre-Vatican II thinking. And what's hard is in the online sphere, usually when you are listening to Roman Catholics, a lot of them still think in a pre-Vatican II way. So their argumentation is made in a pre-Vatican II way. Rather than the post-Vatican II way, I would actually want to contend, as would like my friend Brett Salkeld, that's actually more faithful to somebody like Thomas and to the great tradition. So people think Vatican II is novel. Actually, Vatican II is relearning from the patristics. And from, honestly, I think from the Anglican Ad Fontes movement of drawing back to the patristics. And I think it's reevaluating Thomas's actual teachings. And so Vatican II is not some like novel liberal thing. It's actually a profoundly ancient thing that's retrieving this. And I'd say it's doing it in line with the critiques that had come out of the Reformation. And so some of those critiques actually, I think, eventually found their way into Roman thinking. But I know Henri de Lubac was deeply, in like his work Corpus Mysticum, deeply cares about the sign and the res distinction. And I think actually almost all Anglican theology from the Reformation was built off of trying to get back to that type of thinking. That the sign is distinct from the res, but the sign points to the res, but we don't want to collapse the two. But we also don't want to separate them completely. And so anyways, where was I going with this? So that's the case. And then again, the initial agreement between Rome and the Anglican Communion was from 1971. And I'd say it's like the most significant one of them all. It's called the Windsor Statement. What's fascinating is both Austin Suggs and Trent Horn have brought this up recently on their channels, which is really cool to me. But beyond that, then there was 20 years of further reflection. And the final note from the Episcopal Church, giving an official reflection to the USCCB, included the language of propitiatory sacrifice and said, because of anamnesis, this language is proper. So that's where I just want to be careful to state that it's like, to some degree, I guess the way my theology works is I look at this and I start with the larger, like this coherence, if it's discerned by the wider church, and I think it pans out. And the more I dive into it, the more I think it pans out. The more I go into the typology, it pans out. Then the questions you're asking in my mind should be within the larger framework, not trying to build up an epistemology just from those questions. Does that make sense? That's how I would approach it. It's not that the questions aren't appropriate to wrestle through. I think they are. I just would start with a meta framework. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, bro. Like what particular things are holding you up, and can you even perceive a world where maybe those could be overcome depending on what's meant by the language?
Yeah, absolutely. I've started to read some of those archaic documents. I've read some of the earlier ones. I don't think I've gotten to the one that talks about the Anglicans affirming the language of propitiatory. I'd be interested to read that and see.
Yeah, I'll send it to you on a personal note after this. But yeah.
Yeah, but no, those have been helpful for sure. So I need to read more.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I don't want to pigeonhole you, man. What do you think about this notion? So I want to go back to this just a little bit. When we talked about, you brought up, I want to be careful because I almost think it's like Lutherans don't normally like the term like consubstantiation. They like the term mystical union. But I wanted to go back to something and get your reflections on this. And again, in my mind, all of these things are correlated with omniscience, which is interesting. To me, almost every theological topic is. But I wanted to go back to this a little bit because we were talking about it before. So when I talked to Brett Salkeld again, so a lot of Anglicans, and I know like Dr. Gavin Ortland, who really respect, has used this notion. We have a whole section in our dialogue where we talk about, is Chalcedon appropriate to apply to the Eucharist? Because that's the language that a lot of Anglicans would use, is they say, well, in Chalcedon, Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, and therefore that should be the logic of the Eucharist. And Dr. Brett Salkeld, I'll let anybody watching this go and see his direct reflections. But I think his answer was really, really interesting and can really help move the conversation forward, how he particularly responded to that claim. And he basically says that as important as chalcedon is, and as important as the principles are, they don't apply one-to-one for the reasons of the telos of something when it comes to the Eucharist. And so the question that I want to say is, like, let's say if we were to just remove the term transubstantiation, this would be my question for you, Alex. Do you feel comfortable with this notion of, like, in my view, and again, not just my view, I think this is the heart of Archic and kind of why they've come to the decisions they have. The reason why Rome was always leery of saying that bread remained in substance after the words of institution, after the anaphora, this is my body, this is my blood, was because what's going on there is it's a bringing about of new creation. So when we receive the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, what we are receiving is new creation, full stop. And so the concern, I believe, for Rome was saying, if you say bread remains, are you saying that old creation remains when we eat it? Or is it completely new creation? And so that, I think, was Rome's contention, is that it can't be 50% old creation and 50% new creation. It has, and not 100% old creation, 100% new creation. It has to be 100% new creation, period. I think that, in my view, is what Rome's view on transubstantiation is at a core dogmatic level. But then what Anglicanism was always worried about is it, quote, overthroweth the nature of a sacrament. And so the Anglican thing was always that God takes the old creation and perfects it into the new. And this is where Brett Salkeld brings up this notion of the telos of something. And so he said, but the difference is that the telos, again, of a man is still a man at the end. The telos of bread is not bread. The telos of bread, the new creation, ultimate reality of bread, is body. Because bread goes into our bodies, and its telos is to feed our bodies and to build our bodies. So the telos of bread is not to remain eternally bread. The telos of bread is body. And so since it's new creation, it cannot remain bread because it's new creation. Now, we can still use the term bread, which even the Roman Catholic rites in the Novus Ordo use the term bread. Like right after the words of institution, they'll say, when we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. So they still use terminology of bread because the accidents are still a real thing. So the outward signs via which we receive the substance are still real, and they're still real. But the substance itself is the new creation. And that's the point of transubstantiation. And in the Archic documents, the Anglicans say that takes into account what we were always worried about, that the accidents still are real, and that the bread is not destroyed, it's perfected, right? It's not that, this is Aquinas, grace doesn't destroy nature, it perfects it. And so it perfects it to its telos. And I think that the image of Jesus's resurrected body is like the perfect image, where in his resurrected body, right, he's gone from 100% old creation to 100% new creation. And yet he still has his original body with the nail holes. It's been drawn into its telos. So anyways, I don't know if you have, like, if we were to leave out the term transubstantiation and leave out Aristotelian metaphysics, which the Archic document says Aristotelian metaphysics are not requisite to the Roman view. Do you find any problems with that language? And if you don't feel comfortable answering that, feel free to say that too. But I was just curious, that notion of transference to new creation and a perfection of the telos. Do you hear that, and does it throw up any red flags for you, or do you hear that as coherent?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm regretting now that I didn't listen to your conversation with Brett Salkeld. Yeah. I listened to the conversation between him and Gavin Ortland. I think they did still end up disagreeing at the end of it all. But
that's what my whole point in my dialogue was to, and I say this in the video, I'm trying to pick up on his dialogue with Gavin Ortland, which, by the way, however many years ago that came out, I was in the place that you said you've been in, Alex, where I'm sitting there watching this and I want to jump into the screen like, no, we can go further. But they came to, Gavin Ortland basically said Chalcedon, that's the difference. And they never really resolved that. And that's what I wanted to talk with Dr. Salkeld. I wanted to pick up off of that conversation and try to resolve it from the Anglican mind anyways. So anyway.
I definitely need to listen to that. I was reading Irenaeus a while back, and this is where he gives that exact thought. I do think it's several church fathers. They give that exact analogy of like the bread and wine, right? we offer the earthly elements, right? And we receive a union of the heavenly and earthly elements, right, at the consecration, in the way that Christ is fully God and fully man. And he's actually using this in an argument against Gnostics to prove the incarnation. So he's kind of saying, Irenaeus is saying, our theology of the Eucharist proves our theology of the incarnation, which was just very striking to me. And I always sort of grabbed onto that as being like, that makes a lot of sense to me. I do understand. Yeah, I understand the concern of new creation. Man, it's I probably need to listen to the conversation, think about it more.
Yeah. Well, maybe at some point in the future, bro. I hope to have you. I hope we can chat a lot more, bro. Because I seriously, I see you as a wonderful just theologian and dialogue partner. But I think that's the question I would just bridge to people right now.
Yeah.
And if you want, I put timestamps as well. If people don't have time to watch the whole video, I put one on when we talk about Chalcedon there. I think Dr. Brett's reasoning there, though, does draw where there's a distinction between the way that Chalcedon's parsed out and the way we parse out the Eucharist. There is a distinction, but I don't think that eliminates, some of the insights of people like Irenaeus or whatnot. But I think again, the whole question is about new creation, and actually the agreed upon statements between Rome and the Anglican Communion, they're very eschatological. And I guess in my theology, bro, and this then brings us back to the question of omniscience. Eschatology is the way to solve things. People think that the way to solve all these problems is to go back in time and argue about things forever. And in my mind, the actual way to solve it is to go into the future and try to argue from the eschaton. Because I think and as fuzzy as that may sound, I actually think it's really principled. The eschaton has a lot to say about the now. And so when we think, actually like the core of transubstantiation and the core of the Anglican position, even if they didn't call it transubstantiation, is inherently eschatological. And if we think eschatologically, that can help us solve some things from the past and get beyond some of the language barriers that have caused division. Because at some points, the word transubstantiation, and to most Anglicans today, I still think means something that they don't actually mean by it. Anglicans think it means something that I don't think Rome actually means. I think what Rome actually means fits beautifully with what we've thought for a long time at our core. Although we need to develop too, we've learned things from Rome as well, and to be a little more careful with some categories. It's eschatology that helps bridge that gap. And I think that the liturgy comes into play here too, because the liturgy is ultimately eschatological. And that's the Mass. And so I think all of those things, so I guess just the way I think about theology again is that there's like overlaying realities where they've got like, again, the 7 days of creation, the 7 moons of salvation history, Revelation, and the Mass are all 7 realities that stack up together right down the line. And there's something to that. And we can think that's true and still be historians and try to read things contextually. And in my mind, that's part of the beauty of Anglicanism, is we can think exegetically like N.T. Wright and say like, okay, let's go back to the first century. Let's understand what this meant in light of first century thinking. But we can also think in meta-narrative typological levels and hold those together. And anyways, I'll stop there, bro. I'll let you give your reflections here. But in my mind, that's where the question of omniscience comes in. Because if God is synonymously present at all times at once, it makes a lot more sense of why we would see these refracting or echoing realities occur again and again and again. It only makes sense. It would only make sense, I think, fully if those things are overlaying. I guess Calvinism could try to make an argument for that, but I think it makes more sense to say that they're overlaying. Because then it still allows for real human cooperation with realities. But anyways, I just said a lot, bro. I'll let you kind of riff from there. I do want to say too, guys, because I know it's getting later, if anybody has any final thoughts, comments they want to drop in the chat, do it now. Before we sign off. But Alex, I'll let you go ahead and give any reflections you have from there, brother.
Yeah, no, that's all. That's great. I really have to listen to that conversation with Brett Sockhold. He's obviously very, very knowledgeable. Are there any books, documents on the Eucharist that have helped you? I mean, you mentioned I think you mentioned that Archic document. Have there been any other books that have helped you out in your understanding? Oh, sorry, I don't know if I lost you. Lost him. Oh yeah, thank you, chat. Quay scenes. Now I know that you're Colin's friend, so I might read your book. From Conflict to Communion.
Dude, I am so sorry. Can you hear me,
All
bro?
good. All good.
So that's what happens when you don't plug your computer in and you stop paying attention. I'm so sorry.
All good, man.
Oh man,
Yeah.
I apologize. Your first live stream and I left you all by yourself, dude. You got the limelight.
All good. The chat was helping me out.
There you go, bro. They're like, this guy does this all the time to us. You've seen live stream where my mic turned off for like 45 minutes, like 30, 45 minutes. And like 10 people stayed on while I was just talking without anybody being able to hear me. It was outrageous.
They're all
so anyways, please go ahead.
I was just asking you, are there any like books or documents that have helped you with your understanding of the Eucharist? You mentioned that Archic document. I definitely want to read that. Are there any others you'd recommend?
So, I mean, definitely, I think Archic is the best place to start because I think the Archic is it's condensed. Sorry, guys, you're gonna hear my kids having Paw Patrol stuff. Hey, guys, please go upstairs for a sec, okay? This is real life. I know you get it, Alex. So I would say Archic. I would also say, I mean. There's another great document that came out from the World Council of Churches called Baptism Eucharist Ministry, which is really about anamnesis. That came out in the 80s. That goes beyond Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism. So it's called BEM, or Baptism Eucharist Ministry. That was a very foundational document. I would also say, I mean, there's beautiful stuff. Like I believe it's Maskell who has beautiful works on the Eucharist. I would say Corpus Mysticum by Henri de Lubac has great stuff. But then I would also say, I know people have strong reactions to this. I have no idea what your reflections are on this, Alex, or on the 39 articles just in general. But I would say something like Tract 90 from St. John Henry Newman that really tries to find bridges between basically Trent and the Anglican view historically. And Arthur Michael Ramsey, which is the man who I'm probably one of the people I'm most indebted to, he has a great book called The Anglican Spirit. It's not particularly on the Eucharist, but he, in that book, talks about how St. John Henry Newman was basically vindicated ultimately in ecumenical dialogues, as that is the methodology that's used, that's most real, is a hermeneutic of trying to work through the past contextually rather than systematically. And so I would say if you really want a good book to turn to, or other people, I would say The Anglican Spirit by Arthur Michael Ramsey is a really good place to start. And what was the one other one I wanted to say? And I would say Dr. Salkeld's book on transubstantiation, I think, is a modern book that you could turn to that tries to really go into depth about the Calvinist view, the Lutheran view, the Anglican view, and the Roman Catholic view, and Thomas's view, and try to parse out the history very carefully. So I would say I would probably start with transubstantiation from Dr. Salkeld to Tract 90. I would say you could read that in conjunction with Arthur Michael Ramsey's book, The Anglican Spirit, to kind of get just a different way that Anglicans in the 20th century have thought about some of these questions. And then obviously there's some older Anglican works that are great too. I think it's Maskell who wrote another great book on the Eucharist particularly, but yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'll definitely have to check those out.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, look at Clay says the chat was lit on the mic off night. I know, man. That was the legendary night. Somebody commented the next day and was like, that live stream last night was wild, which is pretty funny. So anyways, and then Quay also puts in the chat the short RC Lutheran work From Conflict to Communion. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just
Yeah.
say again, I would start again. I think Archic is a really good short condensed thing to look at. I would also say, bro, I know this is a totally different topic, but the question of the Archic document about Mary is a very, very, very good case study in how you parse out deeply complicated things biblically, sociologically, and historically and theologically. And so the way that they parse out Marian dogma, it's not just basic, right? It goes like deep, deep, deep into like the theology of new creation from St. John's Gospel. Because St. John's Gospel, I would say, is really all about new creation. And they go deep into that and why Mary switches from being his mother. It's like she's always his mother, but her primary role in the Gospel of John switches at one point from going from his mother to his disciple. And then it's all about how her life is the type of a disciple. So the document goes deep there. It goes very deep into the sociology, which is what I was talking about of like neo-Thomism and why certain things were promulgated at the end of the 18th century, 19th century and beginning of the 20th century that may not have been like why did they feel a need to promulgate those things? And when you understand the sociology, it helps make sense of what is the core of the theology that needs to be believed by all. And so it goes into that. It goes into this notion of space and time and how those questions affect everything, basically. So I'm just saying, I know that's a totally different subject, but to me, it's a case study in how you do this type of how this type of thinking occurs in ecumenical levels. Yeah, so those would be some of my reflections. So, well,
All
Alex,
right, thanks. I'll have to check those out.
yeah, bro. So, guys, I don't know if anybody has any final comments or questions. Alex, do you have anything final plugs you want to give or just comments? Again, I just want to say for anybody following, please check out Alex's channel. Keep in mind when you're a young channel, subscribing to it and just like giving it some love can really, really help just get it off the ground. I just really want to plug your channel, Alex. Even though again, I said, I know you have stuff on there that, we wouldn't necessarily see eye to eye, like when it comes to transubstantiation. But I do think that I think you have an extremely thoughtful theological mind. I think that your work on these questions of God's omniscience is really, really really good. I think it's really good, and I just appreciate the way you approach theology and your thought process. So I want to just encourage you in your journey. I think you have a lot to offer the church through this ministry. So, but do you have any final things you want to plug, bro, as you as we kind of conclude here?
That's it, really. I mean, if people want to check out my channel, my videos, watch those if you enjoy them. Again, as you say, like I'm really just working through all this live in front of everybody.
Yeah.
I hope I may change my views over time. I hope I'm not, misunderstanding or misrepresenting anyone as I work through these views, but I just ask for people's patience, and I really appreciate, dialogues like this. This helps me understand where other people are coming from. So
yeah,
thank you so much for chatting tonight. This is awesome.
Yeah,
Again,
it's a joy, bro. We'll have to do it again.
It's a live YouTube video where I'm actually participating. I'm involved.
It's cool, man. All right, I have to tell you something funny, and then I'll sign off here in just a sec. But I remember when I first started doing YouTube, it wasn't that long ago, and I put I had already responded to Sean Luke or something like this, and I remember I put a comment in his chat, and he pulled up my name so that I could see my face on it. And he said something about it. I remember running upstairs and telling my wife, look, they talked about me in this video. It was she was like, you're such a fangirl, Colin. You're such a fanboy or something. It was pretty funny, man. But
I would fangirl if Sean Luke commented on my video. So
yeah, that's pretty funny, man. So yeah, bro. Well, dude, you're a legend, man. I will just say too, just again on a personal note, I'll say it even though it's live. The one encouragement I would give you with that though too is recognize that you have gifts from God too. And so as much as you respect these other people you're engaging with and as important that is, and I still respect the people who I grew up respecting, God's also given you a real voice and you have something to share too. And so, your ministry is important too. So I just want to encourage you in that, man, because I think you have a lot to offer. And I really hope we get to keep connecting because I feel like for one, you're a great dialogue partner. Two, I think you're incredibly learned on these things. Honestly, even though you feel like you're just discerning through them, I am too in some ways. You're incredibly learned on them. And then on top of that, I also think that I actually think that that notion of I do think you have to be careful what you post because you don't ever want to speak on that which you know not, and that's true for me, right? Like I wonder sometimes if I do that. I got into a dialogue once with just on a chat with Dr. Cooper, Dr. Jordan Cooper about Lutheranism, and I'm like, man, I'm probably out of my league here, but but with that said, I know it can also help people. Like I think Austin Suggs' journey is a great example where I think he's really helped people trying to wrestle through. And some people have come to different conclusions. But I think to some degree, we also have to leave that to God. So it's that fine balance between not wanting to overstate a case. And that's where I'm really careful. I don't ever want to like misframe or misrepresent another view. But you also have to try to really say things, and that's just something that we all have to keep wrestling through. I have to be careful with Calvinism because I can do that sometimes growing up as a Wesleyan, to just speak on what I think Calvinism to be, but obviously it's a greater tradition. So anyways, cool, man. Well, Alex, you're a legend, bro. Can I go ahead and close this in prayer unless you have any final comments you want to say?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for chatting. I enjoyed it. Hope we can do it again.
Yeah, me too, bro. All right, cool. Let me find a collect for today that we can read. All right. Sorry, guys. All right, what collect do I want to read here? All right, I'll go ahead and find one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is the collect of the reign of Christ. Actually, no, I'll read for the unity of the church. Almighty Father, whose blessed Son before his passion prayed for his disciples that they might be one, as you and he are one. Grant that your church, being bound together in love and obedience to you, may be united in one body by the one Spirit, that the world may believe in him whom you have sent, your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Alex, you're a legend, dude. Thanks for joining in. I'm super stoked, and we'll have to do this again sometime soon, man.
All right. Appreciate it.
Have a good night, guys.